The Goloshes of Fortune. In a house in Copenhagen, not far from the king's new market, a very large party had assembled, the host and his family expecting, no doubt, to receive invitations in return. One half of the company were already seated at the card tables. The other half seemed to be waiting the result of their hostess's question. "Well, how shall we amuse ourselves?" Conversation followed, which, after a while, began to prove very entertaining. Among other subjects, it turned upon the events of the Middle Ages, which some persons maintained were more full of interest than our own times. Councillor Knapp defended this opinion so warmly that the lady of the house immediately went over to his side, and both exclaimed against Ørsted's essays on ancient and modern times, in which the preference is given to our own. The councillor considered the times of the Danish king Hans as the noblest and happiest. The conversation on this topic was only interrupted for a moment by the arrival of a newspaper, which did not, however, contain much worth reading, and while it is still going on, we will pay a visit to the anteroom, in which cloaks, sticks, and goloshes were carefully placed. Here sat two maidens, one young and the other old, as if they had come and were waiting to accompany their mistresses home, but on looking at them more closely, it could easily be seen that they were no common servants. Their shapes were too graceful, their complexions too delicate, and the cut of their dresses much too elegant. They were two fairies. The younger was not Fortune herself, but the chambermaid of one of Fortune's attendants, who carries about her more trifling gifts. The elder one, who was named Care, looked rather gloomy. She always goes about to perform her own business in person, for then she knows it is properly done. They were telling each other where they had been during the day. The messenger of Fortune had only transacted a few unimportant matters. For instance, she had preserved a new bonnet from a shower of rain, and obtained for an honest man a bow from a titled nobody, and so on. But she had something extraordinary to relate after all. "I must tell you," said she, "that today is my birthday, and in honor of it I have been entrusted with a pair of goloshes to introduce amongst mankind. These goloshes have the property of making everyone who puts them on imagine himself in any place he wishes, or that he exists at any period. Every wish is fulfilled at the moment it is expressed, so that for once mankind have the chance of being happy." "No," replied Care. "You may depend upon it that whoever puts on those goloshes will be very unhappy, and bless the moment in which he can get rid of them." "What are you thinking of?" replied the other. "Now see, I will place them by the door. Someone will take them instead of his own, and he will be the happy man." This was the end of their conversation. It was late when Councillor Knapp, lost in thought about the times of King Hans, desired to return home, and fate so ordered it that he put on the goloshes of Fortune instead of his own, and walked out into the East Street. Through the magic power of the goloshes, he was at once carried back 300 years to the times of King Hans, for which he had been longing when he put them on. Therefore he immediately set his foot into the mud and mire of the street, which in those days possessed no pavement. "Why, this is horrible! How dreadfully dirty it is!" said the councillor. "And the whole pavement has vanished, and the lamps are all out." The moon had not yet risen high enough to penetrate the thick foggy air, and all the objects around him were confused together in the darkness. At the nearest corner a lamp hung before a picture of the Madonna, but the light it gave was almost useless, for he only perceived it when he came quite close and his eyes fell on the painted figures of the mother and child. "That is most likely a museum of art," thought he, "and they have forgotten to take down the sign." Two men in the dress of olden times passed by him. "What odd figures," thought he. They must be returning from some masquerade. Suddenly he heard the sound of a drum and fiefs, and then a blazing light from torches shone upon him. The councillor stared with astonishment as he beheld a most strange procession pass before him. First came a whole troop of drummers, beating their drums very cleverly. They were followed by lifeguards, with longbows and crossbows. The principal person in the procession was a clerical-looking gentleman. The astonished councillor asked what it all meant and who the gentleman might be. "That is the Bishop of Zealand." "Good gracious!" he exclaimed. "What in the world has happened to the bishop? What can he be thinking about?" Then he shook his head and said, "It cannot possibly be the bishop himself." While musing on this strange affair, and without looking to the right or left, he walked on through East Street and over Highbridge Place. The bridge, which he supposed led to Palace Square, was nowhere to be found, but instead he saw a bank and some shallow water, and two people who sat in a boat. "Does the gentleman wish to be ferried over the Holme?" asked one. "To the Holme!" exclaimed the councillor, not knowing in what age he was now existing. "I want to go to Christian's Haven in Little Turf Street." The men stared at him. "Pray tell me where the bridge is," said he. "It is shameful that the lamps are not lighted here, and it is as muddy as if one were walking in a marsh." But the more he talked with the boatmen, the less they could understand each other. "I don't understand your outlandish talk," he cried at last, angrily turning his back upon them. He could not, however, find the bridge, nor any railings. "What a scandalous condition this place is in," said he. Never, certainly, had he found his own time so miserable as on this evening. "I think it will be better for me to take a coach, but where are they?" There was not one to be seen. "I shall be obliged to go back to the King's New Market," said he, "where there are plenty of carriages standing, or I shall never reach Christian's Haven." Then he went towards East Street, and had nearly passed through it, when the moon burst forth from a cloud. "Dear me, what have they been erecting here?" he cried, as he caught sight of the East Gate, which in olden times used to stand at the end of East Street. However, he found an opening through which he passed, and came out upon where he expected to find the New Market. Nothing was to be seen but an open meadow, surrounded by a few bushes, through which ran a broad canal or stream. A few miserable-looking wooden booths, for the accommodation of Dutch watermen, stood on the opposite shore. "Either I behold a fata morgana, or I must be tipsy," groaned the councillor. "What can it be? What is the matter with me?" He turned back in the full conviction that he must be ill. In walking through the street this time, he examined the houses more closely. He found that most of them were built of lath and plaster, and many had only a thatched roof. "I am certainly all wrong," said he with a sigh, "and yet I only drank one glass of punch. But I cannot bear even that, and it was very foolish to give us punch and hot salmon. I shall speak about it to our hostess, the agent's lady. Suppose I were to go back now and say how ill I feel, I fear it would look so ridiculous, and it is not very likely that I should find anyone up." Then he looked for the house, but it was not in existence. "This is really frightful. I cannot even recognize East Street. Not a shop to be seen, nothing but old, wretched, tumble-down houses, just as if I were at Roscoda or Ringstead. Oh, I really must be ill. It is no use to stand upon ceremony. But where in the world is the agent's house? There is a house, but it is not his, and people still up in it, I can hear. Oh dear, I certainly am very queer." As he reached the half-open door, he saw a light and went in. It was a tavern of the olden times, and seemed a kind of beer shop. The room had the appearance of a Dutch interior. A number of people, consisting of seamen, Copenhagen citizens, and a few scholars sat in deep conversation over their mugs and took very little notice of the newcomer. "Pardon me," said the counsellor, addressing the landlady. "I do not feel quite well, and I should be much obliged if you will send for a fly to take me to Christian's Haven." The woman stared at him and shook her head. Then she spoke to him in German. The counsellor supposed from this that she did not understand Danish. He therefore repeated his request in German. This, as well as his singular dress, convinced the woman that he was a foreigner. She soon understood, however, that he did not find himself quite well, and therefore brought him a mug of water. It had something of the taste of sea water, certainly, although it had been drawn from the well outside. Then the counsellor leaned his head on his hand, drew a deep breath, and pondered over all the strange things that had happened to him. "Is that today's number of the day?" he asked, quite mechanically, as he saw the woman putting by a large piece of paper. She did not understand what he meant, but she handed him the sheet. It was a woodcut representing a meteor, which had appeared in the town of Cologne. "That is very old," said the counsellor, becoming quite cheerful at the sight of this antique drawing. "Where did you get this singular sheet? It is very interesting, although the whole affair is a fable. Meteors are easily explained in these days. They are northern lights, which are often seen and are no doubt caused by electricity." Those who sat near him and heard what he said looked at him in great astonishment, and one of them rose, took off his hat respectfully, and said in a very serious manner, "You must certainly be a very learned man, monsieur." "Oh, no," replied the counsellor. "I can only discourse on topics which everyone should understand." "Modestia is a beautiful virtue," said the man. "Moreover, I must add to your speech, mihi secus videtur. Yet in this case I would suspend my judicium. May I ask to whom I have the pleasure of speaking?" "I am a bachelor of divinity," said the man. This answer satisfied the counsellor. The title agreed with the dress. "This is surely," thought he, "an old village schoolmaster, a perfect original, such as one meets with sometimes even in Jutland." "This is not certainly a locus docendi," began the man. "Still I must beg you to continue the conversation. You must be well read in ancient law." "Oh, yes," replied the counsellor. "I am very fond of reading useful old books, and modern ones as well, with the exception of everyday stories, of which we really have more than enough." "Everyday stories?" asked the bachelor. "Yes, I mean the new novels that we have at the present day." "Oh," replied the man with a smile, "and yet they are very witty, and are much read at court. The king likes especially the romance of Messieurs Iffven and Gordian, which describes King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. He has joked about it with the gentlemen of his court." "Well, I have certainly not read that," replied the counsellor. "I suppose it is quite new, and published by Heiberg." "No," answered the man, "it is not by Heiberg. Gottfried von Gaiman brought it out." "Oh, is he the publisher?" "That is a very old name," said the counsellor. "Was it not the name of the first publisher in Denmark?" "Yes, and he is our first printer and publisher now," replied the scholar. So far all had passed off very well, but now one of the citizens began to speak of a terrible pestilence which had been raging a few years before, meaning the plague of 184. The counsellor thought he referred to the cholera, and they could discuss this without finding out the mistake. The war in 1490 was spoken of as quite recent. The English pirates had taken some ships in the Channel in 1801, and the counsellor, supposing they referred to these, agreed with them in finding fault with the English. The rest of the talk, however, was not so agreeable. Every moment one contradicted the other. The good bachelor appeared very ignorant, for the simplest remark of the counsellor seemed to him either too bold or too fantastic. They stared at each other, and when it became worse, the bachelor spoke in Latin, in the hope of being better understood, but it was all useless. "How are you now?" asked the landlady, pulling the counsellor's sleeve. Then his recollection returned to him. In the course of conversation he had forgotten all that had happened previously. "Goodness me, where am I?" said he. It bewildered him as he thought of it. "We will have some claret, or mead, or Bremen beer," said one of the guests. "Will you drink with us?" 2 maids came in. One of them had a cap on her head of 2 colours. They poured out the wine, bowed their heads, and withdrew. The counsellor felt a cold shiver run all over him. "What is this? What does it mean?" said he. But he was obliged to drink with them, for they overpowered the good man with their politeness. He became at last desperate, and when one of them said he was tipsy, he did not doubt the man's word in the least, only begged them to get a droshky. And then they thought he was speaking the Muscovite language. Never before had he been in such rough and vulgar company. "One might believe that the country was going back to heathenism," he observed. "This is the most terrible moment of my life." Just then it came into his mind that he would stoop under the table and so creep to the door. He tried it, but before he reached the entry, the rest discovered what he was about and seized him by the feet, when, luckily for him, off came the goloshes, and with them vanished the whole enchantment. The counsellor now saw quite plainly a lamp, and a large building behind it. Everything looked familiar and beautiful. He was in East Street. As it now appears, he lay with his legs turned towards a porch, and just by him sat the watchman asleep. "Is it possible that I have been lying here in the street dreaming?" said he. "Yes, this is East Street. How beautifully bright and gay it looks. It is quite shocking that one glass of punch should have upset me like this." 2 minutes afterwards he sat in a droshky, which was to drive him to Christian's Haven. He thought of all the terror and anxiety which he had undergone, and felt thankful from his heart for the reality and comfort of modern times, which, with all their errors, were far better than those in which he so lately found himself. "Well, I declare, there lies a pair of goloshes," said the watchman. "No doubt. They belong to the lieutenant who lives upstairs. They are lying just by his door. Gladly would the honest man have rung and given them in, for a light was still burning. But he did not wish to disturb the other people in the house, so he let them lie. "These things must keep the feet very warm," said he. "They are of such nice soft leather." Then he tried them on, and they fitted his feet exactly. "Now," said he, "how droll things are in this world. There's that man can lie down in his warm bed, but he does not do so. There he goes pacing up and down the room. He ought to be a happy man. He has neither wife nor children, and he goes out into company every evening. Oh, I wish I were he, then I should be a happy man." As he uttered this wish, the goloshes which he had put on took effect, and the watchman at once became the lieutenant. There he stood in his room, holding a little piece of pink paper between his fingers, on which was a poem written by the lieutenant himself. Who has not had, for once in his life, a moment of poetic inspiration? And at such a moment, if the thoughts are written down, they flow in poetry. The following verses were written on the pink paper. "Oh, were I rich! Oh, were I rich! How oft, in youth's bright hour, when youthful pleasures banish every care, I longed for riches, but to gain a power, the sword and plume and uniform to wear. The riches and the honour came for me, yet still my greatest wealth was poverty. Ah, help and pity me! Once in my youthful hours, when gay and free, a maiden loved me, and her gentle kiss, rich in its tender love and purity, taught me, alas, too much of earthly bliss. Dear child, she only thought of youthful glee. She loved no wealth, but fairy tales and me. Thou knowest, pity me. Oh, were I rich! Again is all my prayer. That child is now a woman, fair and free, as good and beautiful as angels are. Oh, were I rich in lover's poetry, to tell my fairy tale, love's richest lore. But no, I must be silent. I am poor. Ah, wilt thou pity me? Oh, were I rich in truth and peace below, I need not then my poverty bewail. To thee I dedicate these lines of woe. Wilt thou not understand the mournful tale? A leaf on which my sorrows I relate? Dark story of a darker night of fate. Ah, bless and pity me. Well, yes, people write poems when they are in love, but a wise man will not print them. A lieutenant in love and poor. This is a triangle, or, more properly speaking, the half of the broken die of fortune. The lieutenant felt this very keenly, and therefore leaned his head against the window frame and sighed deeply. The poor watchman in the street, said he, is far happier than I am. He knows not what I call poverty. He has a home, a wife and children, who weep at his sorrow and rejoice at his joy. Oh, how much happier I should be could I change my being and position with him, and pass through life with his humble expectations and hopes. Yes, he is indeed happier than I am. At this moment the watchman again became a watchman, for having, through the goloshes of fortune, passed into the existence of the lieutenant, and found himself less contented than he expected, he had preferred his former condition, and wished himself again a watchman. That was an ugly dream, said he, but droll enough. It seemed to me as if I were the lieutenant up yonder, but there was no happiness for me. I missed my wife and the little ones, who are always ready to smother me with kisses. He sat down again and nodded, but he could not get the dream out of his thoughts, and he still had the galoshes on his feet. A falling star gleamed across the sky. There goes one, cried he. However, there are quite enough left. I should very much like to examine these a little nearer, especially the moon, for that could not slip away under one's hands. The student, for whom my wife washes, says that when we die we shall fly from one star to another. If that were true, it would be very delightful, but I don't believe it. I wish I could make a little spring up there now. I would willingly let my body lie here on the steps. There are certain things in the world which should be uttered very cautiously, doubly so when the speaker has on his feet the goloshes of fortune. Now we shall hear what happened to the watchman. Nearly everyone is acquainted with the great power of steam. We have proved it by the rapidity with which we can travel, both on a railroad or in a steamship across the sea. But this speed is like the movements of the sloth or the crawling march of the snail. When compared to the swiftness with which light travels, light flies 19 million times faster than the fittest racehorse, and electricity is more rapid still. Death is an electric shock which we receive in our hearts, and on the wings of electricity the liberated soul flies away swiftly. The light from the sun travels to our earth, 95 millions of miles in 8 minutes and a few seconds, but on the wings of electricity, the mind requires only a second to accomplish the same distance. The space between the heavenly bodies is, to thought, no farther than the distance which we may have to walk from one friend's house to another in the same town. Yet this electric shock obliges us to use our bodies here below, unless, like the watchman, we have on the galoshes of fortune. In a very few seconds, the watchman had travelled more than 200,000 miles to the moon, which is formed of a lighter material than our Earth, and may be said to be as soft as new fallen snow. He found himself on one of the circular range of mountains which we see represented in Dr. Madler's large map of the moon. The interior had the appearance of a large hollow, bowl-shaped, with a depth about half a mile from the brim. Within this hollow stood a large town. We may form some idea of its appearance by pouring the white of an egg into a glass of water. The materials of which it was built seemed just as soft, and pictured forth cloudy turrets and sail-like terraces, quite transparent and floating in the thin air. Our earth hung over his head like a great dark red ball. Presently he discovered a number of beings, which might certainly be called men, but were very different to ourselves. A more fantastical imagination than Herschel's must have discovered these. Had they been placed in groups and painted, it might have been said, "What beautiful foliage!" They had also a language of their own. No one could have expected the soul of the watchman to understand it, and yet he did understand it. For our souls have much greater capabilities than we are inclined to believe. Do we not, in our dreams, show a wonderful dramatic talent? Each of our acquaintance appears to us then in his own character, and with his own voice. No man could thus imitate them in his waking hours. How clearly, too! We are reminded of persons whom we have not seen for many years. They start up suddenly to the mind's eye with all their peculiarities as living realities. In fact, this memory of the soul is a fearful thing. Every sin, every sinful thought it can bring back. And we may well ask how we are to give account of every idle word that may have been whispered in the heart or uttered with the lips. The spirit of the watchman therefore understood very well the language of the inhabitants of the moon. They were disputing about our earth and doubted whether it could be inhabited. The atmosphere, they asserted, must be too dense for any inhabitants of the moon to exist there. They maintained that the moon alone was inhabited and was really the heavenly body in which the old world people lived. They likewise talked politics. But now we will descend to East Street and see what happened to the watchman's body. He sat lifeless on the steps. His staff had fallen out of his hand, and his eyes stared at the moon, about which his honest soul was wandering. "What is it o'clock, watchman?" inquired a passenger. But there was no answer from the watchman. The man then pulled his nose gently, which caused him to lose his balance. The body fell forward and lay at full length on the ground as one dead. All his comrades were very much frightened, for he seemed quite dead. Still they allowed him to remain after they had given notice of what had happened, and at dawn the body was carried to the hospital. We might imagine it to be no jesting matter if the soul of the man should chance to return to him, for most probably it would seek for the body in East Street without being able to find it. We might fancy the soul inquiring of the police, or at the address office, or among the missing parcels, and then at length finding it at the hospital. But we may comfort ourselves by the certainty that the soul, when acting upon its own impulses, is wiser than we are. It is the body that makes it stupid. As we have said, the watchman's body had been taken to the hospital, and here it was placed in a room to be washed. Naturally, the first thing done here was to take off the goloshes, upon which the soul was instantly obliged to return, and it took the direct road to the body at once, and in a few seconds the man's life returned to him. He declared, when he quite recovered himself, that this had been the most dreadful night he had ever passed. Not for £100 would he go through such feelings again. However, it was all over now. The same day he was allowed to leave, but the goloshes remained at the hospital. Every inhabitant of Copenhagen knows what the entrance to Frederick's hospital is like. But as most probably a few of those who read this little tale may not reside in Copenhagen, we will give a short description of it. The hospital is separated from the street by an iron railing, in which the bars stand so wide apart that, it is said, some very slim patients have squeezed through and gone to pay little visits in the town. The most difficult part of the body to get through was the head, and in this case, as it often happens in the world, the small heads were the most fortunate. This will serve as sufficient introduction to our tale. One of the young volunteers, of whom, physically speaking, it might be said that he had a great head, was on guard that evening at the hospital. The rain was pouring down, yet, in spite of these two obstacles, he wanted to go out just for a quarter of an hour. It was not worth while, he thought, to make a confidant of the porter, as he could easily slip through the iron railings. There lay the goloshes, which the watchman had forgotten. It never occurred to him that these could be goloshes of fortune. They would be very serviceable to him in this rainy weather, so he drew them on. Now came the question whether he could squeeze through the palings. He certainly had never tried, so he stood looking at them. "I wish to goodness my head was through," said he, and instantly, though it was so thick and large, it slipped through quite easily. The goloshes answered that purpose very well, but his body had to follow, and this was impossible. "I am too fat," he said. "I thought my head would be the worst, but I cannot get my body through, that is certain." Then he tried to pull his head back again, but without success. He could move his neck about easily enough, and that was all. His first feeling was one of anger, and then his spirits sank below zero. The goloshes of fortune had placed him in this terrible position, and unfortunately it never occurred to him to wish himself free. No, instead of wishing he kept twisting about, yet did not stir from the spot. The rain poured, and not a creature could be seen in the street. The porter's bell he was unable to reach, and however was he to get loose? He foresaw that he should have to stay there till morning, and then they must send for a smith to file away the iron bars, and that would be a work of time. All the charity children would just be going to school, and all the sailors who inhabited that quarter of the town would be there to see him standing in the pillory. What a crowd there would be! "Ah," he cried, "the blood is rushing to my head, and I shall go mad. I believe I am crazy already. Oh, I wish I were free, then all these sensations would pass off." This is just what he ought to have said at first. The moment he had expressed the thought, his head was free. He started back, quite bewildered with the fright which the goloshes of fortune had caused him. But we must not suppose it was all over. No, indeed, there was worse to come yet. The night passed, and the whole of the following day, but no one sent for the goloshes. In the evening, a declamatory performance was to take place at the amateur theatre in a distant street. The house was crowded. Among the audience was the young volunteer from the hospital, who seemed to have quite forgotten his adventures of the previous evening. He had on the goloshes, they had not been sent for, and as the streets were still very dirty, they were of great service to him. A new poem entitled "My Aunt's Spectacles" was being recited. It described these spectacles as possessing a wonderful power if anyone put them on in a large assembly. The people appeared like cards, and the future events of ensuing years could be easily foretold by them. The idea struck him that he should very much like to have such a pair of spectacles, for, if used rightly, they would perhaps enable him to see into the hearts of people, which he thought would be more interesting than to know what was going to happen next year for future events would be sure to show themselves. But the hearts of people never. I can fancy what I should see in the whole row of ladies and gentlemen on the first seat, if I could only look into their hearts. That lady, I imagine, keeps a store for things of all descriptions. How my eyes would wander about in that collection. With many ladies, I should no doubt find a large millinery establishment. There is another that is perhaps empty, and would be all the better for cleaning out. There may be some well stored with good articles. Ah, yes, he sighed, I know one in which everything is solid, but a servant is there already, and that is the only thing against it. I dare say from many I should hear the words, please to walk in. I only wish I could slip into the hearts like a little tiny thought. This was the word of command for the galoshes. The volunteers shrunk up together and commenced a most unusual journey through the hearts of the spectators in the first row. The first heart he entered was that of a lady, but he thought he must have got into one of the rooms of an orthopedic institution where plaster casts of deformed limbs were hanging on the walls, with this difference, that the casts in the institution are formed when the patient enters, but here they were formed and preserved after the good people had left. These were casts of the bodily and mental deformities of the lady's female friends carefully preserved. Quickly he passed into another heart, which had the appearance of a spacious holy church, with the white dove of innocence fluttering over the altar. Gladly would he have fallen on his knees in such a sacred place, but he was carried on to another heart, still, however, listening to the tones of the organ and feeling himself that he had become another and a better man. The next heart was also a sanctuary, which he felt almost unworthy to enter. It represented a mean garret in which lay a sick mother, but the warm sunshine streamed through the window. Lovely roses bloomed in a little flower box on the roof. 2 bluebirds sang of childlike joys, and the sick mother prayed for a blessing on her daughter. Next he crept on his hands and knees through an overfilled butcher's shop. There was meat, nothing but meat, wherever he stepped. This was the heart of a rich, respectable man, whose name is doubtless in the directory. Then he entered the heart of this man's wife. It was an old, tumble-down pigeon-house. The husband's portrait served as a weathercock. It was connected with all the doors, which opened and shut just as the husband's decision turned. The next heart was a complete cabinet of mirrors, such as can be seen in the castle of Rosenberg. But these mirrors magnified in an astonishing degree. In the middle of the floor sat, like the Grand Lama, the insignificant eye of the owner, astonished at the contemplation of his own features. At his next visit, he fancied he must have got into a narrow needle case, full of sharp needles. Oh, thought he, this must be the heart of an old maid, but such was not the fact. It belonged to a young officer who wore several orders, and was said to be a man of intellect and heart. The poor volunteer came out of the last heart in the row quite bewildered. He could not collect his thoughts, and imagined his foolish fancies had carried him away. Good gracious, he sighed, I must have a tendency to softening of the brain, and here it is so exceedingly hot that the blood is rushing to my head. And then suddenly recurred to him the strange event of the evening before, when his head had been fixed between the iron railings in front of the hospital. "That is the cause of it all," he exclaimed. "I must do something in time. A Russian bath would be a very good thing to begin with. I wish I were lying on one of the highest shelves." Sure enough, there he lay on an upper shelf of a vapour bath, still in his evening costume, with his boots and goloshes on, and the hot drops from the ceiling falling on his face. "Oh!" he cried, jumping down and rushing towards the plunging bath. The attendant stopped him with a loud cry. when he saw a man with all his clothes on. The volunteer had, however, presence of mind enough to whisper, "It is for a wager." But the first thing he did, when he reached his own room, was to put a large blister on his neck and another on his back, that his crazy fit might be cured. The next morning his back was very sore, which was all he gained by the goloshes of fortune. The watchman, whom we of course have not forgotten, thought, after a while, of the goloshes which he had found and taken to the hospital, so he went and fetched them. But neither the lieutenant nor anyone in the street could recognize them as their own, so he gave them up to the police. "They look exactly like my own goloshes," said one of the clerks, examining the unknown articles as they stood by the side of his own. "It would require even more than the eye of a shoemaker to know one pair from the other." "Master Clerk," said a servant who entered with some papers. The clerk turned and spoke to the man. But when he had done with him, he turned to look at the goloshes again, and now he was in greater doubt than ever as to whether the pair on the right or on the left belonged to him. "Those that are wet must be mine," thought he, but he thought wrong. It was just the reverse. The goloshes of fortune were the wet pair, and, besides, why should not a clerk in a police office be wrong sometimes? So he drew them on, thrust his papers into his pocket, placed a few manuscripts under his arm, which he had to take with him, and to make abstracts from at home. Then, as it was Sunday morning and the weather very fine, he said to himself, "A walk to Fredericksburg will do me good," so away he went. There could not be a quieter or more steady young man than this clerk. We will not grudge him this little walk. It was just the thing to do him good after sitting so much. He went on at first like a mere automaton, without thought or wish. Therefore the goloshes had no opportunity to display their magic power. In the avenue he met with an acquaintance, one of our young poets, who told him that he intended to start on the following day on a summer excursion. "Are you really going away so soon?" asked the clerk. "What a free, happy man you are! You can roam about where you will, while such as we are tied by the foot." "But it is fastened to the bread tree," replied the poet. "You need have no anxiety for the morrow, and when you are old there is a pension for you." "Ah, yes, but you have the best of it," said the clerk. "It must be so delightful to sit and write poetry. The whole world makes itself agreeable to you, and then you are your own master. You should try how you would like to listen to all the trivial things in a court of justice." The poet shook his head, so also did the clerk. Each retained his own opinion, and so they parted. "They are strange people, these poets," thought the clerk. "I should like to try what it is to have a poetic taste, and to become a poet myself. I am sure I should not write such mournful verses as they do. This is a splendid spring day for a poet. The air is so remarkably clear, the clouds are so beautiful, and the green grass has such a sweet smell. For many years I have not felt as I do at this moment." We perceive, by these remarks, that he had already become a poet. By most poets, what he had said would be considered commonplace, or, as the Germans call it, insipid. It is a foolish fancy to look upon poets as different to other men. There are many who are more the poets of nature than those who are professed poets. The difference is this: the poet's intellectual memory is better. He seizes upon an idea or a sentiment until he can embody it clearly and plainly in words, which the others cannot do. But the transition from a character of everyday life to one of a more gifted nature is a great transition. And so the clerk became aware of the change after a time. "What a delightful perfume," said he. "It reminds me of the violets at Aunt Laura's. Ah, that was when I was a little boy. Dear me, how long it seems since I thought of those days. She was a good old maiden lady. She lived yonder, behind the exchange. She always had a sprig or a few blossoms in water, let the winter be ever so severe. I could smell the violets. Even while I was placing warm penny pieces against the frozen panes to make peepholes, and a pretty view it was on which I peeped. Out in the river lay the ships, ice-bound, and forsaken by their crews. A screaming crow represented the only living creature on board. But when the breezes of spring came, everything started into life. Amidst shouting and cheers, the ships were tarred and rigged, and then they sailed to foreign lands. I remain here, and always shall remain, sitting at my post at the police office, and letting others take passports to distant lands. Yes, this is my fate." And he sighed deeply. Suddenly he paused. "Good gracious, what has come over me? I never felt before as I do now. It must be the air of spring. It is overpowering, and yet it is delightful." He felt in his pockets for some of his papers. "These will give me something else to think of," said he. Casting his eyes on the first page of one, he read, "Mistress Sigbert, an original tragedy in 5 acts. What is this? In my own handwriting, too. Have I written this tragedy?" He read again, "The Intrigue on the Promenade, or The Fast Day of Vaudeville. However did I get all this? Someone must have put them into my pocket, and here is a letter." It was from the manager of a theatre. The pieces were rejected, not at all in polite terms. "Hem, hem," said he, sitting down on a bench. His thoughts were very elastic, and his heart softened strangely. Involuntarily, he seized one of the nearest flowers. It was a little, simple daisy. All that botanists can say in many lectures was explained in a moment by this little flower. It spoke of the glory of its birth. It told of the strength of the sunlight, which had caused its delicate leaves to expand and given to it such sweet perfume. The struggles of life which arouse sensations in the bosom have their type in the tiny flowers. Air and light are the lovers of the flowers, but light is the favoured one. Towards light it turns, and only when light vanishes does it fold its leaves together and sleep in the embraces of the air." "It is light that adorns me," said the flower. "But the air gives you the breath of life," whispered the poet. Just by him stood a boy, splashing with his stick in a marshy ditch. The water drops spurted up among the green twigs, and the clerk thought of the millions of animalculae which were thrown into the air with every drop of water, at a height which must be the same to them as it would be to us if we were hurled beyond the clouds. As the clerk thought of all these things, and became conscious of the great change in his own feelings, he smiled and said to himself, "I must be asleep and dreaming. And yet, if so, how wonderful for a dream to be so natural and real, and to know at the same time, too, that it is but a dream. I hope I shall be able to remember it all when I wake tomorrow. My sensations seem most unaccountable. I have a clear perception of everything as if I were wide awake. I'm quite sure if I recollect all this tomorrow, it will appear utterly ridiculous and absurd. I have had this happen to me before. It is with the clever or wonderful things we say or hear in dreams, as with the gold which comes from under the earth. It is rich and beautiful when we possess it, but when seen in a true light, it is but as stones and withered leaves." "Ah," he sighed mournfully, as he gazed at the birds singing merrily, or hopping from branch to branch, "they are much better off than I. Flying is a glorious power. Happy is he who is born with wings. Yes, if I could change myself into anything, I would be a little lark." At the same moment his coat-tails and sleeves grew together and formed wings. His clothes changed to feathers, and his galoshes to claws. He felt what was taking place and laughed to himself. Well, now it is evident I must be dreaming, but I never had such a wild dream as this. And then he flew up into the green boughs and sang, but there was no poetry in the song, for his poetic nature had left him. The goloshes, like all persons who wished to do a thing thoroughly, could only attend to one thing at a time. He wished to be a poet, and he became one. Then he wanted to be a little bird, and in this change he lost the characteristics of the former one. Well, thought he, this is charming. By day I sit in a police office amongst the driest law papers, and at night I can dream that I am a lark flying about in the gardens of Fredericksburg. Really a complete comedy could be written about it. Then he flew down into the grass, turned his head about in every direction, and tapped his beak on the bending blades of grass, which, in proportion to his size, seemed to him as long as the palm leaves in northern Africa. In another moment all was darkness around him. It seemed as if something immense had been thrown over him. A sailor boy had flung his large cap over the bird, and a hand came underneath and caught the clerk by the back and wings so roughly that he squeaked, and then cried out in his alarm, "You impudent rascal! I am a clerk in the police office." But it only sounded to the boy like tweet, tweet, so he tapped the bird on the beak and walked away with him. In the avenue he met two schoolboys who appeared to belong to a better class of society, but whose inferior abilities kept them in the lowest class at school. These boys bought the bird for 8 pence, and so the clerk returned to Copenhagen. "It is well for me that I am dreaming," he thought. "Otherwise I should become really angry. First I was a poet, and now I am a lark. It must have been the poetic nature that changed me into this little creature. It is a miserable story indeed, especially now I have fallen into the hands of boys. I wonder what will be the end of it." The boys carried him into a very elegant room, where a stout, pleasant-looking lady received them, but she was not at all gratified to find that they had brought a lark, a common field bird, as she called it. However, she allowed them for one day to place the bird in an empty cage that hung near the window. "It will please Polly, perhaps," she said, laughing at a large grey parrot, who was swinging himself proudly on a ring in a handsome brass cage. "It is Polly's birthday," she added in a simpering tone, "and the little field bird has come to offer his congratulations." Polly did not answer a single word. He continued to swing proudly to and fro, but a beautiful canary, who had been brought from his own warm, fragrant fatherland the summer previous, began to sing as loud as he could. "You screamer!" said the lady, throwing a white handkerchief over the cage. "Tweet, tweet," sighed he, "what a dreadful snowstorm!" And then he became silent. The clerk, or as the lady called him, the field bird, was placed in a little cage close to the canary and not far from the parrot. The only human speech which Polly could utter, and which she sometimes chattered forth most comically, was, "Now let us be men." All besides was a scream, quite as unintelligible as the warbling of the canary bird, excepting to the clerk, who, being now a bird, could understand his comrades very well. "I flew beneath green palm trees and amidst the blooming almond trees," sang the canary. "I flew with my brothers and sisters over beautiful flowers, and across the clear, bright sea, which reflected the waving foliage in its glittering depths. And I have seen many gay parrots who could relate long and delightful stories." "They were wild birds," answered the parrot, "and totally uneducated. Now let us be men. Why do you not laugh? If the lady and her visitors can laugh at this, surely you can. It is a great failing not to be able to appreciate what is amusing. Now let us be men." "Do you remember," said the canary, "the pretty maidens who used to dance in the tents that were spread out beneath the sweet blossoms? Do you remember the delicious fruit and the cooling juice from the wild herbs?" "Oh, yes," said the parrot. "But here I am much better off. I am well fed and treated politely. I know that I have a clever head, and what more do I want? Let us be men now. You have a soul for poetry. I have deep knowledge and wit. You have genius, but no discretion. You raise your naturally high notes so much that you get covered over. They never serve me so. Oh no, I cost them something more than you. I keep them in order with my beak and fling my wit about me. Now let us be men." "Oh, my warm, blooming fatherland," sang the canary bird, "I will sing of thy dark green trees and thy quiet streams, where the bending branches kiss the clear, smooth water. I will sing of the joy of my brothers and sisters, as their shining plumage flits among the dark leaves of the plants which grow wild by the springs." "Do leave off those dismal strains," said the parrot. "Sing something to make us laugh. Laughter is the sign of the highest order of intellect. Can a dog or a horse laugh? No, they can cry. But to man alone is the power of laughter given." "Ha! Ha! Ha!" laughed Polly, and repeated his witty saying, "Now let us be men." "You little grey Danish bird," said the canary, "you also have become a prisoner. It is certainly cold in your forests, but still there is liberty there. Fly out! They have forgotten to close the cage, and the window is open at the top. Fly! Fly!" Instinctively the clerk obeyed, and left the cage. At the same moment, the half-open door leading into the next room creaked on its hinges, and, stealthily, with green, fiery eyes, the cat crept in and chased the lark round the room. The canary bird fluttered in his cage, and the parrot flapped his wings and cried, "Let us be men." The poor clerk, in the most deadly terror, flew through the window, over the houses, and through the streets, till at length he was obliged to seek a resting place. A house opposite to him had a look of home. A window stood open. He flew in and perched upon the table. It was his own room. "Let us be men now," said he, involuntarily imitating the parrot, and at the same moment he became a clerk again, only that he was sitting on the table. "Heaven preserve us," said he. "How did I get up here and fall asleep in this way? It was an uneasy dream, too, that I had. The whole affair appears most absurd." Early on the following morning, while the clerk was still in bed, his neighbour, a young divinity student who lodged on the same story, knocked at his door and then walked in. "Lend me your goloshes," said he. "It is so wet in the garden, but the sun is shining brightly. I should like to go out there and smoke my pipe." He put on the goloshes, and was soon in the garden, which contained only one plum tree and one apple tree, yet in a town even a small garden like this is a great advantage. The student wandered up and down the path. It was just 6 o'clock, and he could hear the sound of the post horn in the street. "Oh, to travel, to travel!" cried he. "There is no greater happiness in the world. It is the height of my ambition. This restless feeling would be stilled if I could take a journey far away from this country. I should like to see beautiful Switzerland, to travel through Italy." And it was well for him that the goloshes acted immediately. Otherwise he might have been carried too far for himself as well as for us. In a moment he found himself in Switzerland, closely packed with 8 others in the diligence. His head ached, his back was stiff, and the blood had ceased to circulate, so that his feet were swelled and pinched by his boots. He wavered in a condition between sleeping and waking. In his right-hand pocket he had a letter of credit. In his left-hand pocket was his passport, and a few louis d'ors were sewn into a little leather bag which he carried in his breast pocket. Whenever he dozed, he dreamed that he had lost one or another of these possessions. Then he would awake with a start, and the first movements of his hand formed a triangle from his right-hand pocket to his breast, and from his breast to his left-hand pocket, to feel whether they were all safe. Umbrellas, sticks, and hats swung in the net before him, and almost obstructed the prospect, which was really very imposing. And as he glanced at it, his memory recalled the words of one poet at least, who has sung of Switzerland, and whose poems have not yet been printed. How lovely to my wondering eyes Mont Blanc's fair summits gently rise! 'Tis sweet to breathe the mountain air, if you have gold enough to spare. Grand, dark, and gloomy appeared the landscape around him. The pine forests looked like little groups of moss on high rocks whose summits were lost in clouds of mist. Presently it began to snow, and the wind blew keen and cold. "Ah," he sighed, "if I were only on the other side of the Alps now, it would be summer, and I should be able to get money on my letter of credit. The anxiety I feel on this matter prevents me from enjoying myself in Switzerland. Oh, I wish I was on the other side of the Alps." And there, in a moment, he found himself far away in the midst of Italy, between Florence and Rome, where the lake Trasimene glittered in the evening sunlight like a sheet of molten gold between the dark blue mountains. There, where Hannibal defeated Flaminius, the grapevines clung to each other with the friendly grasp of their green tendril fingers, while, by the wayside, lovely half-naked children were watching a herd of coal-black swine under the blossoms of fragrant laurel. Could we rightly describe this picturesque scene, our readers would exclaim, "Delightful Italy!" But neither the student nor either of his travelling companions felt the least inclination to think of it in this way. Poisonous flies and gnats flew into the coach by thousands. In vain they drove them away with a myrtle branch. The flies stung them notwithstanding. There was not a man in the coach whose face was not swollen and disfigured with the stings. The poor horses looked wretched. The flies settled on their backs in swarms, and they were only relieved when the coachman got down and drove the creatures off. As the sun set, an icy coldness filled all nature, not however of long duration. It produced the feeling which we experience when we enter a vault at a funeral on a summer's day, while the hills and the clouds put on that singular green hue which we often notice in old paintings, and look upon as unnatural, until we have ourselves seen nature's colouring in the south. It was a glorious spectacle, but the stomachs of the travellers were empty, their bodies exhausted with fatigue, and all the longings of their heart turned towards a resting place for the night. But where to find one? They knew not. All the eyes were too eagerly seeking for this resting place to notice the beauties of nature. The road passed through a grove of olive trees. It reminded the student of the willow trees at home. Here stood a lonely inn, and close by it a number of crippled beggars had placed themselves. The brightest among them looked, to quote the words of Marryat, like the eldest son of famine who had just come of age. The others were either blind or had withered legs, which obliged them to creep about on their hands and knees, or they had shriveled arms and hands without fingers. It was indeed poverty arrayed in rags. "Excellenza! Miserabili!" they exclaimed, stretching forth their diseased limbs. The hostess received the travellers with bare feet, untidy hair, and a dirty blouse. The doors were fastened together with string. The floors of the rooms were of brick, broken in many places. Bats flew about under the roof. And as to the odour within, "Let us have supper laid in the stable," said one of the travellers. "Then we shall know what we are breathing." The windows were opened to let in a little fresh air, but quicker than air came in the withered arms and the continual whining sounds, Miserabili, Excellenza. On the walls were inscriptions, half of them against La Bella Italia. The supper made its appearance at last. It consisted of watery soup, seasoned with pepper and rancid oil. This last delicacy played a principal part in the salad. Musty eggs and roasted cock's combs were the best dishes on the table. Even the wine had a strange taste. It was certainly a mixture. At night, all the boxes were placed against the doors, and one of the travellers watched while the others slept. The student's turn came to watch. How close the air felt in that room! The heat overpowered him. The gnats were buzzing about and stinging, while the miserabili outside moaned in their dreams. "Travelling would be all very well," said the student of divinity to himself, "if we had no bodies, or if the body could rest while the soul, if flying. Wherever I go, I feel a want which oppresses my heart. For something better presents itself at the moment, yes, something better, which shall be the best of all. But where is that to be found? In fact, I know in my heart very well what I want. I wish to attain the greatest of all happiness." No sooner were the words spoken than he was at home. Long white curtains shaded the windows of his room, and in the middle of the floor stood a black coffin, in which he now lay in the still sleep of death. His wish was fulfilled, his body was at rest, and his spirit travelling. "Esteem no man happy until he is in his grave," were the words of Solon. Here was a strong, fresh proof of their truth. Every corpse is a sphinx of immortality. The sphinx in this sarcophagus might unveil its own mystery in the words which the living had himself written 2 days before. "Stern death, thy chilling silence waketh dread, yet in thy darkest hour there may be light. Earth's garden reaper, from the grave's cold bed, the soul on Jacob's ladder takes her flight. Man's greatest sorrows often are a part of hidden griefs concealed from human eyes, which press far heavier on the lonely heart than now the earth that on his coffin lies." 2 figures were moving about the room. We know them both. One was the fairy named Care, the other the messenger of fortune. They bent over the dead. "Look," said Care, "what happiness have your goloshes brought to mankind?" "They have at least brought lasting happiness to him who slumbers here," she said. "Not so," said Care. "He went away of himself. He was not summoned. His mental powers were not strong enough to discern the treasures which he had been destined to discover. I will do him a favor now." And she drew the goloshes from his feet. The sleep of death was ended, and the recovered man raised himself. Care vanished, and with her the goloshes. Doubtless she looked upon them as her own property. The happy family. The largest green leaf in this country is certainly the burdock leaf. If you hold it in front of you, it is large enough for an apron, and if you hold it over your head, it is almost as good as an umbrella. It is so wonderfully large. A burdock never grows alone. Where it grows, there are many more, and it is a splendid sight, and all this splendor is good for snails. The great white snails, which grand people in olden times used to have made into fricassees, and when they had eaten them, they would say, "Oh, what a delicious dish!" For these people really thought them good, and these snails lived on burdock leaves, and for them the burdock was planted. There was once an old estate where no one now lived to require snails. Indeed, the owners had all died out. But the burdock still flourished. It grew over all the beds and walks of the garden. Its growth had no check, till it became at last quite a forest of burdocks. Here and there stood an apple or a plum tree, but for this nobody would have thought the place had ever been a garden. It was burdock from one end to the other, and here lived the last two surviving snails. They knew not themselves how old they were, but they could remember the time when there were a great many more of them, and that they were descended from a family which came from foreign lands, and that the whole forest had been planted for them and theirs. They had never been away from the garden, but they knew that another place once existed in the world, called the Duke's Palace Castle, in which some of their relations had been boiled till they became black and were then laid on a silver dish. But what was done afterwards they did not know. Besides, they could not imagine exactly how it felt to be boiled and placed on a silver dish, but no doubt it was something very fine and highly genteel. Neither the cockchafer, nor the toad, nor the earthworm, whom they questioned about it, would give them the least information, for none of their relations had ever been cooked or served on a silver dish. The old white snails were the most aristocratic race in the world. They knew that. The forest had been planted for them, and the nobleman's castle had been built entirely that they might be cooked and laid on silver dishes. They lived quite retired and very happily, and as they had no children of their own, they had adopted a little common snail, which they brought up as their own child. The little one would not grow, for he was only a common snail, but the old people, particularly the mother snail, declared that she could easily see how he grew, and when the father said he could not perceive it, she begged him to feel the little snail's shell, and he did so, and found that the mother was right. One day it rained very fast. "Listen, what a drumming there is on the burdock leaves! Turn, 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 turn," said the father snail. "There come the drops," said the mother. "They are trickling down the stalks. We shall have it very wet here presently. I am very glad we have such good houses, and that the little one has one of his own. There has been really more done for us than for any other creature. It is quite plain that we are the most noble people in the world. We have houses from our birth, and the burdock forest has been planted for us. I should very much like to know how far it extends, and what lies beyond it." "There can be nothing better than we have here," said the father snail. "I wish for nothing more." "Yes, but I do," said the mother. "I should like to be taken to the palace and boiled and laid upon a silver dish, as was done to all our ancestors, and you may be sure it must be something very uncommon." "The nobleman's castle, perhaps, has fallen to decay," said the snail father, "or the burdock wood may have grown out. You need not be in a hurry. You are always so impatient, and the youngster is getting just the same. He has been 3 days creeping to the top of that stalk. I feel quite giddy when I look at him." "You must not scold him," said the mother snail. "He creeps so very carefully. He will be the joy of our home, and we old folks have nothing else to live for. But have you ever thought where we are to get a wife for him? Do you think that farther out in the wood there may be others of our race?" "There may be black snails, no doubt," said the old snail. "Black snails without houses, but they are so vulgar and conceited too. But we can give the ants a commission. They run here and there, as if they all had so much business to get through. They, most likely, will know of a wife for our youngster." "I certainly know a most beautiful bride," said one of the ants, "but I fear it would not do, for she is a queen." "That does not matter," said the old snail. "Has she a house?" "She has a palace," replied the ant, "a most beautiful ant palace with 700 passages." "Thank you," said the mother snail, "but our boy shall not go to live in an ant-hill. If you know of nothing better, we will give the commission to the white gnats. They fly about in rain and sunshine. They know the burdock wood from one end to the other." "We have a wife for him," said the gnats. 100 man steps from here, there is a little snail with a house sitting on a gooseberry bush. She is quite alone and old enough to be married. It is only 100 man steps from here. "Then let her come to him," said the old people. "He has the whole burdock forest, she has only a bush." So they brought the little lady snail. She took 8 days to perform the journey, but that was just as it ought to be, for it showed her to be one of the right breeding. And then they had a wedding. 6 glowworms gave as much light as they could, but in other respects it was all very quiet, for the old snails could not bear festivities or a crowd. But a beautiful speech was made by the mother snail. The father could not speak, he was too much overcome. Then they gave the whole burdock forest to the young snails as an inheritance, and repeated what they had so often said, that it was the finest place in the world, and that if they led upright and honourable lives and their family increased, they and their children might some day be taken to the nobleman's palace to be boiled black and laid on a silver dish. And when they had finished speaking, the old couple crept into their houses and came out no more, for they slept. The young snail pair now ruled in the forest and had a numerous progeny, but as the young ones were never boiled or laid in silver dishes, they concluded that the castle had fallen into decay, and that all the people in the world were dead, and as nobody contradicted them, they thought they must be right. And the rain fell upon the burdock leaves to play the drum for them, and the sun shone to paint colours on the burdock forest for them, and they were very happy. The whole family were entirely and perfectly happy. Be Ice Maiden. We will pay a visit to Switzerland and wander through that country of mountains whose steep and rocky sides are overgrown with forest trees. Let us climb to the dazzling snowfields at their summits, and descend again to the green meadows beneath, through which rivers and brooks rush along as if they could not quickly enough reach the sea and vanish. Fiercely shines the sun over those deep valleys, as well as upon the heavy masses of snow which lie on the mountains. During the year these accumulations thaw or fall in the rolling avalanches, or are piled up in shining glaciers. 2 of these glaciers lie in the broad rocky cliffs between the Schreckhorn and the Wetterhorn, near the little town of Grindelwald. They are wonderful to behold, and therefore in the summer-time strangers come here from all parts of the world to see them. They cross snow-covered mountains and travel through the deep valleys, or ascend for hours, higher and still higher, the valleys appearing to sink lower and lower as they proceed, and become as small as if seen from an air balloon. Over the lofty summits of these mountains the clouds often hang like a dark veil, while beneath in the valley, where many brown wooden houses are scattered about, the bright rays of the sun may be shining upon a little brilliant patch of green, making it appear almost transparent. The waters foam and dash along in the valleys beneath. The streams from above trickle and murmur as they fall down the rocky mountain side, looking like glittering silver bands. On both sides of the mountain path stand these little wooden houses, and, as within, there are many children and many mouths to feed. Each house has its own little potato garden. These children rush out in swarms and surround travellers, whether on foot or in carriages. They are all clever at making a bargain. They offer for sale the sweetest little toy houses, models of the mountain cottages in Switzerland. Whether it be rain or sunshine, these crowds of children are always to be seen with their wares. About 20 years ago, there might be seen occasionally, standing at a short distance from the other children, a little boy who was also anxious to sell his curious wares. He had an earnest, expressive countenance, and held the box containing his carved toys tightly with both hands, as if unwilling to part with it. His earnest look, and being also a very little boy, made him noticed by the strangers, so that he often sold the most without knowing why. An hour's walk farther up the ascent lived his grandfather, who cut and carved the pretty little toy houses, and in the old man's room stood a large press full of all sorts of carved things. nutcrackers, knives and forks, boxes with beautifully carved foliage, leaping chamois. It contained everything that could delight the eyes of a child. But the boy, who was named Rudy, looked with still greater pleasure and longing at some old firearms which hung upon the rafters under the ceiling of the room. His grandfather promised him that he should have them some day, but that he must first grow big and strong and learn how to use them. Small as he was, the goats were placed in his care, and a good goat keeper should also be a good climber. And such Rudy was, he sometimes, indeed, climbed higher than the goats, for he was fond of seeking for birds' nests at the top of high trees. He was bold and daring, but was seldom seen to smile, excepting when he stood by the roaring cataract or heard the descending roll of the avalanche. He never played with the other children, and was not seen with them, unless his grandfather sent him down to sell his curious workmanship. Rudy did not much like trade. He loved to climb the mountains, or to sit by his grandfather and listen to his tales of olden times, or of the people in Meiringen, the place of his birth. "In the early ages of the world," said the old man, "these people could not be found in Switzerland. They are a colony from the north, where their ancestors still dwell and are called Swedes." This was something for Rudy to know, but he learned more from other sources, particularly from the domestic animals who belonged to the house. One was a large dog called Ahola, which had belonged to his father, and the other was a tomcat. This cat stood very high in Rudy's favor, for he had taught him to climb. "Come out on the roof with me," said the cat, and Rudy quite understood him, for the language of fowls, ducks, cats, and dogs is as easily understood by a young child as his own native tongue. But it must be at the age when grandfather's stick becomes a neighing horse, with head, legs, and tail. Some children retain these ideas later than others, and they are considered backwards and childish for their age. People say so, but is it so? "Come out on the roof with me." "Little Rudy," was the first thing he heard the cat say, and Rudy understood him. "What people say about falling down is all nonsense," continued the cat. "You will not fall, unless you are afraid. Come now, set one foot here and another there, and feel your way with your forefeet. Keep your eyes wide open and move softly. And if you come to a hole, jump over it and cling fast as I do." And this was just what Rudy did. He was often on the sloping roof with the cat, or on the tops of high trees, but, more frequently, higher still on the ridges of the rocks where Puss never came. "Higher, higher," cried the trees and the bushes. "See to what height we have grown, and how fast we hold, even to the narrow edges of the rocks." Rudy often reached the top of the mountain before the sunrise, and there inhaled his morning draught of the fresh, invigorating mountain air, God's own gift, which men call the sweet fragrance of plant and herb on the mountainside, and the mint and wild thyme in the valleys. The overhanging clouds absorb all heaviness from the air, and the winds convey them away over the pine tree summits. The spirit of fragrance, light and fresh, remained behind, and this was Rudy's morning draught. The sunbeams, those blessing-bringing daughters of the sun, kissed his cheeks. Vertigo might be lurking on the watch, but he dared not approach him. The swallows, who had not less than 7 nests in his grandfather's house, flew up to him and his goats, singing, "We and you, you and we." They brought him greetings from his grandfather's house, even from 2 hens, the only birds of the household. But Rudy was not intimate with them. Although so young, and such a little fellow, Rudy had travelled a great deal. He was born in the canton of Valais, and brought to his grandfather over the mountains. He had walked to Staubach, a little town that seems to flutter in the air like a silver veil, the glittering, snow-clad mountain, Jungfrau. He had also been to the great glaciers, but this is connected with a sad story, For here his mother met her death, and his grandfather used to say that all Rudy's childish merriment was lost from that time. His mother had written in a letter that before he was a year old he had laughed more than he cried, but after his fall into the snow-covered crevasse, his disposition had completely changed. The grandfather seldom spoke of this, but the fact was generally known. Rudy's father had been a postilion, and the large dog which now lived in his grandfather's cottage had always followed him on his journeys over the Simplon to the Lake of Geneva. Rudy's relations, on his father's side, lived in the canton of Valais, in the valley of the Rhône. His uncle was a chamois hunter and a well-known guide. Rudy was only a year old when his father died, and his mother was anxious to return with her child to her own relations who lived in the Bernese Oberland. Her father dwelt at a few hours' distance from Grindelwald. He was a carver in wood, and gained so much by it that he had plenty to live upon. She set out homewards in the month of June, carrying her infant in her arms, and, accompanied by 2 chamois hunters, crossed the Gemmi on her way to Grindelwald. They had already left more than half the journey behind them. They had crossed high ridges and traversed snowfields. They could even see her native valley with its familiar wooden cottages. They had only one more glacier to climb. Some newly fallen snow concealed a cleft which, though it did not extend to the foaming waters in the depths beneath, was still much deeper than the height of a man. The young woman, with the child in her arms, slipped upon it, sank in, and disappeared. Not a shriek, not a groan was heard, nothing but the whining of a little child. More than an hour elapsed before her 2 companions could obtain from the nearest house ropes and poles to assist in raising them, and it was with much exertion that they at last succeeded in raising from the crevasse what appeared to be 2 dead bodies. Every means was used to restore them to life. With the child they were successful, but not with the mother. So the old grandfather received his daughter's little son into his house, an orphan, a little boy who laughed more than he cried, but it seemed as if laughter had left him in the cold ice world into which he had fallen, where, as the Swiss peasants say, the souls of the lost are confined till the judgment day. The glaciers appear as if a rushing stream had been frozen in its course and pressed into blocks of green crystal, which, balanced one upon another, form a wondrous palace of crystal for the Ice Maiden, the queen of the glaciers. It is she whose mighty power can crush the traveller to death, and arrest the flowing river in its course. She is also a child of the air, and with the swiftness of the chamois she can reach the snow-covered mountain-tops, where the boldest mountaineer has to cut footsteps in the ice to ascend. She will sail on a frail pine twig over the raging torrents beneath, and spring lightly from one iceboat to another, with her long, snow-white hair flowing around her, and her dark green robe glittering like the waters of the deep Swiss lakes. "Mine is the power to seize and crush," she cried. "Once a beautiful boy was stolen from me by man, a boy whom I had kissed but had not kissed to death. He is again among mankind and tends the goats on the mountains. He is always climbing higher and higher, far away from all others, but not from me. He is mine. I will send for him." And she gave Vertigo the commission. It was summer, and the Ice Maiden was melting amidst the green verdure when Vertigo swung himself up and down. Vertigo has many brothers, quite a troop of them, and the Ice Maiden chose the strongest among them. They exercise their power in different ways, and everywhere. Some sit on the banisters of steep stairs, others on the outer rails of lofty towers, or spring like squirrels along the ridges of the mountains. Others tread the air as a swimmer treads the water, and lure their victims here and there till they fall into the deep abyss. Vertigo and the ice maiden clutch at human beings as the polypus seizes upon all that comes within its reach. And now Vertigo was to seize Rudy.
"Seize him indeed!"
cried Vertigo. "I cannot do it. That monster of a cat has taught him her tricks. That child of the human race has a power within him which keeps me at a distance. I cannot possibly reach the boy when he hangs from the branches of trees over the precipice, or I would gladly tickle his feet and send him heels over head through the air, but I cannot accomplish it." "We must accomplish it," said the Ice Maiden. "Either you or I must, and I will. I will." "No, no," sounded through the air, like an echo on the mountain church bell's chime. It was an answer in song, in the melting tones of a chorus from others of nature's spirits. Good and loving spirits, the daughters of the sunbeam. They who place themselves in a circle every evening on the mountain peaks. There they spread out their rose-colored wings, which, as the sun sinks, become more flaming red, until the lofty Alps seem to burn with fire. Men call this the alpine glow. After the sun has set, they disappear within the white snow on the mountain tops, and slumber there till sunrise, when they again come forth. They have great love for flowers, for butterflies, and for mankind. And from among the latter they had chosen little Rudy. "You shall not catch him, you shall not seize him," they sang. "Greater and stronger than he have I seized," said the Ice Maiden. Then the daughters of the sun sang a song of the traveller, whose cloak had been carried away by the wind. The wind took the covering, but not the man. It could even seize upon him, but not hold him fast. The children of strength are more powerful, more ethereal, even than we are. They can rise higher than our parent, the sun. They have the magic words that rule the wind and the waves and compel them to serve and obey, and they can, at last, cast off the heavy, oppressive weight of mortality and soar upwards. Thus sweetly sounded the bell-like tones of the chorus, and each morning the sun's rays shone through the one little window of the grandfather's house upon the quiet child. The daughters of the sunbeam kissed him. They wished to thaw and melt and obliterate the ice kiss which the queenly maiden of the glaciers had given him as he lay in the lap of his dead mother, in the deep crevasse of ice from which he had been so wonderfully rescued. Rudy was just 8 years old when his uncle, who lived on the other side of the mountain, wished to have the boy, as he thought he might obtain a better education with him and learn something more. His grandfather thought the same, so he consented to let him go. Rudy had many to say farewell to, as well as his grandfather. First, there was Ajola, the old dog. "Your father was the postilion, and I was the postilion's dog," said Ajola. "We have often travelled the same journey together. I knew all the dogs and men on this side of the mountain. It is not my habit to talk much, but now that we have so little time to converse together, I will say something more than usual. I will relate to you a story, which I have reflected upon for a long time. I do not understand it, and very likely you will not, but that is of no consequence. I have, however, learnt from it that in this world things are not equally divided, neither for dogs nor for men. All are not born to lie on the lap and to drink milk. I have never been petted in this way, but I have seen a little dog seated in the place of a gentleman or lady, and travelling inside a post-chaise. The lady, who was his mistress, or of whom he was master, carried a bottle of milk, of which the little dog now and then drank. She also offered him pieces of sugar to crunch. He sniffed at them proudly, but would not eat one, so she ate them herself. I was running along the dirty road by the side of the carriage, as hungry as a dog could be, chewing the cud of my own thoughts, which were rather in confusion. But many other things seemed in confusion also. Why was not I lying on a lap and travelling in a coach? I could not tell. Yet I knew I could not alter my own condition, either by barking or growling. This was Ajola's farewell speech, and Rudy threw his arms round the dog's neck and kissed his cold nose. Then he took the cat in his arms, but he struggled to get free. "You are getting too strong for me," he said, "but I will not use my claws against you. Clamber away over the mountains. It was I who taught you to climb. Do not fancy you are going to fall, and you will be quite safe." Then the cat jumped down and ran away. He did not wish Rudy to see that there were tears in his eyes. The hens were hopping about the floor. One of them had no tail. A traveller, who fancied himself a sportsman, had shot off her tail. He had mistaken her for a bird of prey. "Rudy is going away over the mountains," said one of the hens. "He is always in such a hurry," said the other, "and I don't like taking leave," so they both hopped out. But the goats said farewell. They bleated and wanted to go with him. They were so very sorry. Just at this time, two clever guides were going to cross the mountains to the other side of the Gemmi, and Rudy was to go with them on foot. It was a long walk for such a little boy, but he had plenty of strength and invincible courage. The swallows flew with him a little way, singing, "We and you and we." The way led across the rushing Lutschein, which falls in numerous streams from the dark clefts of the Grindelwald glaciers. Trunks of fallen trees and blocks of stone form bridges over these streams. After passing a forest of alders, they began to ascend. Passing by some blocks of ice that had loosened themselves from the side of the mountain and lay across their path, they had to step over these ice blocks or walk round them. Rudy crept here and ran there, his eyes sparkling with joy, and he stepped so firmly with his iron-tipped mountain shoe that he left a mark behind him wherever he placed his foot. The earth was black where the mountain torrents or the melted ice had poured upon it, but the bluish-green, glassy ice sparkled and glittered. They had to go round little pools like lakes, enclosed between large masses of ice, and, while thus wandering out of their path, they came near an immense stone which lay balanced on the edge of an icy peak. The stone lost its balance just as they reached it, and rolled over into the abyss beneath, while the noise of its fall was echoed back from every hollow cliff of the glaciers. They were always going upwards. The glaciers seemed to spread above them like a continued chain of masses of ice, piled up in wild confusion between bare and rugged rocks. Rudy thought for a moment of what had been told him, that he and his mother had once lain buried in one of these cold, heart-chilling fissures. But he soon banished such thoughts, and looked upon the story as fabulous, like many other stories which had been told him. Once or twice, when the men thought the way was rather difficult for such a little boy, they held out their hands to assist him. But he would not accept their assistance, for he stood on the slippery ice as firmly as if he had been a chamois. They came at length to rocky ground, sometimes stepping upon moss-covered stones, sometimes passing beneath stunted fir trees, and again through green meadows. The landscape was always changing, but ever above them towered the lofty snow-clad mountains, whose names not only Rudy, but every other child knew. The Jungfrau, the Monk, and the Eiger. Rudy had never been so far away before. He had never trodden on the wide-spreading ocean of snow that lay here with its immovable billows, from which the wind blows off the snowflake now and then, as it cuts the foam from the waves of the sea. The glaciers stand here so close together, it might almost be said they are hand in hand, and each is a crystal palace for the Ice Maiden, whose power and will it is to seize and imprison the unwary traveller. The sun shone warmly, and the snow sparkled as if covered with glittering diamonds. Numerous insects, especially butterflies and bees, lay dead in heaps on the snow. They had ventured too high, or the wind had carried them here and left them to die of cold. Around the Wetterhorn hung a feathery cloud, like a woolbag, and a threatening cloud too. For as it sunk lower, it increased in size, and concealed within was a foam, fearful in its violence should it break loose. This journey, with its varied incidents, the wild paths, the night passed on the mountain, the steep rocky precipices, the hollow clefts, in which the rustling waters from time immemorial had worn away passages for themselves through blocks of stone, all these were firmly impressed on Rudy's memory. In a forsaken stone building, which stood just beyond the seas of snow, they one night took shelter. Here they found some charcoal and pine branches, so that they soon made a fire. They arranged couches to lie on as well as they could, and then the men seated themselves by the fire, took out their pipes, and began to smoke. They also prepared a warm, spiced drink, of which they partook, and Rudy was not forgotten. He had his share. Then they began to talk of those mysterious beings with which the land of the Alps abounds, the hosts of apparitions which come in the night, and carry off the sleepers through the air to the wonderful floating town of Venice, of the wild herds, man who drives the black sheep across the meadows. These flocks are never seen, yet the tinkle of their little bells has often been heard, as well as their unearthly bleating. Rudy listened eagerly, but without fear, for he knew not what fear meant, and while he listened, he fancied he could hear the roaring of the spectral herd. It seemed to come nearer and roar louder, till the men heard it also, and listened in silence, till, at length, they told Rudy that he must not dare to sleep. It was a foehn, that violent storm wind which rushes from the mountain to the valley beneath, and in its fury snaps asunder the trunks of large trees, as if they were but slender reeds, and carries the wooden houses from one side of a river to the other as easily as we could move the pieces on a chessboard. After an hour had passed, they told Rudy that it was all over, and he might go to sleep, and, fatigued with his long walk, he readily slept at the word of command. Very early the following morning they again set out. The sun on this day lighted up for Rudy new mountains, new glaciers, and new snowfields. They had entered the Canton Valais, and found themselves on the ridge of the hills which can be seen from Grindelwald, but he was still far from his new home. They pointed out to him other clefts, other meadows, other woods and rocky paths, and other houses. Strange men made their appearance before him, and what men! They were misshapen, wretched-looking creatures with yellow complexions, and on their necks were dark, ugly lumps of flesh hanging down like bags. They were called Cretins. They dragged themselves along painfully and stared at the strangers with vacant eyes. The women looked more dreadful than the men. Poor Rudy! Were these the sort of people he should see at his new home? Rudy arrived at last at his uncle's house, and was thankful to find the people like those he had been accustomed to see. There was only one Cretin amongst them, a poor idiot boy, one of those unfortunate beings who, in their neglected conditions, go from house to house and are received and taken care of in different families for a month or two at a time. Poor Sapperli had just arrived at his uncle's house when Rudy came. The uncle was an experienced hunter. He also followed the trade of a cooper. His wife was a lively little person with a face like a bird, eyes like those of an eagle, and a long, hairy throat. Everything was new to Rudy. The fashion of the dress, the manners, the employments, and even the language, but the latter his childish ear would soon learn. He saw also that there was more wealth here, when compared with his former home at his grandfather's. The rooms were larger, the walls were adorned with the horns of the chamois, and brightly polished guns. Over the door hung a painting of the Virgin Mary. Fresh alpine roses and a burning lamp stood near it. Rudy's uncle was, as we have said, one of the most noted chamois hunters in the whole district, and also one of the best guides. Rudy soon became the pet of the house. But there was another pet, an old hound, blind and lazy, who would never more follow the hunt, well as he had once done so. But his former good qualities were not forgotten, and therefore the animal was kept in the family and treated with every indulgence. Rudy stroked the old hound, but he did not like strangers, and Rudy was as yet a stranger. He did not, however, long remain so. He soon endeared himself to every heart, and became like one of the family. "We are not very badly off here in the Canton Valais," said his uncle one day. "We have the chamois. They do not die so fast as the wild goats, and it is certainly much better here now than in former times. How highly the old times have been spoken of, but ours is better. The bag has been opened, and a current of air now blows through our once confined valley. Something better always makes its appearance when old, worn-out things fail." When his uncle became communicative, he would relate stories of his youthful days, and farther back still of the warlike times in which his father had lived. Valais was then, as he expressed it, only a closed-up bag, quite full of sick people, miserable cretins. But the French soldiers came, and they were capital doctors. They soon killed the disease and the sick people too. The French people knew how to fight in more ways than one, and the girls knew how to conquer too. And when he said this, the uncle nodded at his wife, who was a Frenchwoman by birth, and laughed. The French could also do battle on the stones. It was they who cut a road out of the solid rock over the Simplon, such a road that I need only say to a child of 3 years old, "Go down to Italy. You have only to keep in the high road, and the child will soon arrive in Italy, if he followed my directions." Then the uncle sang a French song and cried, "Hurrah! Long live Napoleon Bonaparte!" This was the first time Rudy had ever heard of France, or of Lyon, that great city on the Rhone where his uncle had once lived. His uncle said that Rudy, in a very few years, would become a clever hunter. He had quite a talent for it. He taught the boy to hold a gun properly, and to load and fire it. In the hunting season, he took him to the hills and made him drink the warm blood of the chamois, which is said to prevent the hunter from becoming giddy. He taught him to know the time when, from the different mountains, the avalanche is likely to fall, namely, at noontide or in the evening, from the effects of the sun's rays. He made him observe the movements of the chamois when he gave a leap, so that he might fall firmly and lightly on his feet. He told him that when on the fissures of the rocks he could find no place for his feet, he must support himself on his elbows and cling with his legs, and even lean firmly with his back, for this could be done when necessary. He told him also that the chamois are very cunning. They place lookers out on the watch, but the hunter must be more cunning than they are and find them out by the scent. One day, when Rudy went out hunting with his uncle, he hung a coat and hat on an alpine staff, and the chamois mistook it for a man, as they generally do. The mountain path was narrow here. Indeed, it was scarcely a path at all, only a kind of shelf close to the yawning abyss. The snow that lay upon it was partially thawed, and the stones crumbled beneath the feet. Every fragment of stone broken off struck the sides of the rock in its fall, till it rolled into the depths beneath, and sunk to rest. Upon this shelf, Rudy's uncle laid himself down and crept forward. At about 100 paces behind him stood Rudy, upon the highest point of the rock, watching a great vulture hovering in the air. With a single stroke of his wing, the bird might easily cast the creeping hunter into the abyss beneath and make him his prey. Rudy's uncle had eyes for nothing but the chamois, who, with its young kid, had just appeared round the edge of the rock. So Rudy kept his eyes fixed on the bird. He knew well what the great creature wanted, therefore he stood in readiness to discharge his gun at the proper moment. Suddenly, the chamois made a spring, and his uncle fired and struck the animal with the deadly bullet, while the young kid rushed away, as if for a long life he had been accustomed to danger and practiced flight. The large bird, alarmed at the report of the gun, wheeled off in another direction, and Rudy's uncle was saved from danger, of which he knew nothing till he was told of it by the boy. While they were both in pleasant mood, wending their way homewards, and the uncle whistling the tune of a song he had learnt in his young days, they suddenly heard a peculiar sound which seemed to come from the top of the mountain. They looked up, and saw above them, on the overhanging rock, the snow-covering heave and lift itself as a piece of linen stretched on the ground to dry raises itself when the wind creeps under it. Smooth as polished marble slabs, the waves of snow cracked and loosened themselves, and then suddenly, with the rumbling noise of distant thunder, fell like a foaming cataract into the abyss. An avalanche had fallen, not upon Rudy and his uncle, but very near them. Alas, a great deal too near. "Hold fast, Rudy," cried his uncle. "Hold fast with all your might." Then Rudy clung with his arms to the trunk of the nearest tree, while his uncle climbed above him and held fast by the branches. The avalanche rolled past them at some distance, but the gust of wind that followed, like the storm wings of the avalanche, snapped asunder the trees and bushes over which it swept, as if they had been but dry rushes, and threw them about in every direction. The tree to which Rudy clung was thus overthrown, and Rudy dashed to the ground. The higher branches were snapped off and carried away to a great distance, and among these shattered branches lay Rudy's uncle, with his skull fractured. When they found him, his hand was still warm, but it would have been impossible to recognize his face. Rudy stood by, pale and trembling. It was the first shock of his life, the first time he had ever felt fear. Late in the evening he returned home with the fatal news, to that home which was now to be so full of sorrow. His uncle's wife uttered not a word nor shed a tear till the corpse was brought in. Then her agony burst forth. The poor cretin crept away to his bed, and nothing was seen of him during the whole of the following day. Towards evening, however, he came to Rudy and said, "Will you write a letter for me? Sapperli cannot write. Sapperli can only take the letters to the post." "A letter for you," said Rudy. "Who do you wish to write to?" "To the Lord Christ," he replied. "What do you mean?" asked Rudy. Then the poor idiot, as the cretin was often called, looked at Rudy with a most touching expression in his eyes, clasped his hands, and said, solemnly and devoutly, "Sapperli wants to send a letter to Jesus Christ to pray him to let Sapperli die, and not the master of the house here." Rudy pressed his hand and replied, "A letter would not reach him up above. It would not give him back whom we have lost." It was not, however, easy for Rudy to convince Sapperli of the impossibility of doing what he wished. "Now you must work for us," said his foster-mother, and Rudy very soon became the entire support of the house. Who was the best marksman in the Canton Valais? The chamois knew well. "Save yourselves from Rudy," they might well say. "And who is the handsomest marksman?" "Oh, it is Rudy," said the maidens, but they did not say, "Save yourselves from Rudy." Neither did anxious mothers say so, for he bowed to them as pleasantly as to the young girls. He was so brave and cheerful, his cheeks were brown, his teeth white, and his eyes dark and sparkling. He was now a handsome young man of 20 years. The most icy water could not deter him from swimming. He could twist and turn like a fish. None could climb like he, and he clung as firmly to the edges of the rocks as a limpet. He had strong muscular power, as could be seen when he leapt from rock to rock. He had learnt this first from the cat, and more lately from the chamois. Rudy was considered the best guide over the mountains. Everyone had great confidence in him. He might have made a great deal of money as guide. His uncle had also taught him the trade of a cooper, but he had no inclination for either. His delight was in chamois hunting, which also brought him plenty of money. Rudy would be a very good match, as people said, if he would not look above his own station. He was also such a famous partner in dancing that the girls often dreamt about him, and one and another thought of him even when awake. "He kissed me in the dance," said Annette, the schoolmaster's daughter, to her dearest friend, but she ought not to have told this, even to her dearest friend. It is not easy to keep such secrets. They are like sand in a sieve. They slip out. It was therefore soon known that Rudy, so brave and so good as he was, had kissed someone while dancing, and yet he had never kissed her who was dearest to him. Ah, said an old hunter, he has kissed Annette, has he? He has begun with A, and I suppose he will kiss through the whole alphabet. But a kiss in the dance was all the busy tongues could accuse him of. He certainly had kissed Annette, but she was not the flower of his heart. Down in the valley, near Bex, among the great walnut trees, by the side of a little rushing mountain stream, lived a rich miller. His dwelling house was a large building 3 stories high with little turrets. The roof was covered with chips, bound together with tin plates that glittered in sunshine and in the moonlight. The largest of the turrets had a weathercock, representing an apple pierced by a glittering arrow in memory of William Tell. The mill was a neat and well-ordered place that allowed itself to be sketched and written about, but the miller's daughter did not permit any to sketch or write about her. So, at least, Rudy would have said, for her image was pictured in his heart. Her eyes shone in it so brightly that quite a flame had been kindled there, and, like all other fires, it had burst forth so suddenly that the miller's daughter, the beautiful Babette, was quite unaware of it. Rudy had never spoken a word to her on the subject. The miller was rich, and, on that account, Babette stood very high, and was rather difficult to aspire to. But, said Rudy to himself, nothing is too high for a man to reach. He must climb with confidence in himself, and he will not fail. He had learnt this lesson in his youthful home. It happened once that Rudy had some business to settle at Bex. It was a long journey at that time, for the railway had not been opened. From the glaciers of the Rhône, at the foot of the Simplon, between its ever-changing mountain summits, stretches the valley of the Canton Valley. Through it runs the noble river of the Rhône, which often overflows its banks, covering fields and highways and destroying everything in its course. Near the towns of Sion and Saint-Maurice, the valley takes a turn and bends like an elbow, and behind Saint-Seine, Maurice becomes so narrow that there is only space enough for the bed of the river and a narrow carriage road. An old tower stands here, as if it were guardian to the Canton Valley, which ends at this point, and from it we can look across the stone bridge to the toll house on the other side, where the Canton Vaud commences. Not far from this spot stands the town of Bex, and at every step can be seen an increase of fruitfulness and verdure. It is like entering a grove of chestnut and walnut trees. Here and there the cypress and pomegranate blossoms peep forth, and it is almost as warm as an Italian climate. Rudy arrived at Bex, and soon finished the business which had brought him there, and then walked about the town. But not even the miller's boy could be seen, nor anyone belonging to the mill, not to mention Babette. This did not please him at all. Evening came on. The air was filled with the perfume of the wild thyme and the blossoms of the lime trees, and the green woods on the mountains seemed to be covered with a shining veil, blue as the sky. Over everything reigned a stillness, not of sleep or of death, but as if nature were holding her breath, that her image might be photographed on the blue vault of heaven. Here and there, amidst the trees of the silent valley, stood poles which supported the wires of the electric telegraph. Against one of these poles leaned an object so motionless that it might have been mistaken for the trunk of a tree. But it was Rudy. Standing there, as still as at that moment, was everything around him. He was not asleep. Neither was he dead. But just as the various events in the world, matters of momentous importance to individuals, were flying through the telegraph wires without the quiver of a wire or the slightest tone, so, through the mind of Rudy, thoughts of overwhelming importance were passing, without an outward sign of emotion. The happiness of his future life depended upon the decision of his present reflections. His eyes were fixed on one spot in the distance, a light that twinkled through the foliage from the parlour of the miller's house where Babette dwelt. Rudy stood so still that it might have been supposed he was watching for a chamois, but he was in reality like a chamois, who will stand for a moment, looking as if it were chiselled out of the rock, and then, if only a stone rolled by, would suddenly bound forward with a spring far away from the hunter. And so with Rudy, a sudden roll of his thoughts roused him from his stillness and made him bound forward with determination to act. "Never despair!" cried he. "A visit to the mill, to say good evening to the miller and good evening to little Babette, can do no harm. No one ever fails who has confidence in himself. If I am to be Babette's husband, I must see her some time or other." Then Rudy laughed joyously and took courage to go to the mill. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to marry Babette. The clear water of the river rolled over its yellow bed, and willows and lime trees were reflected in it, as Rudy stepped along the path to the miller's house. But as the children sing, there was no one at home in the house, only a kitten at play. The cat, standing on the steps, put up its back and cried, "Mew!" But Rudy had no inclination for this sort of conversation. He passed on and knocked at the door. No one heard him. No one opened the door. "Mew!" said the cat again. And had Rudy been still a child, he would have understood this language, and known that the cat wished to tell him there was no one at home. So he was obliged to go to the mill and make inquiries, and there he heard that the miller had gone on a journey to Interlaken, and taken Babette with him to the great shooting festival, which began that morning, and would continue for 8 days, and that people from all the German settlements would be there. Poor Rudy! We may well say it was not a fortunate day for his visit to Bex. He had just to return the way he came, through St. Maurice and Sion, to his home in the valley. But he did not despair. When the sun rose the next morning, his good spirits had returned. Indeed, he had never really lost them. "Babette is at Interlaken," said Rudy to himself. "Many days' journey from here. It is certainly a long way for anyone who takes the high road, but not so far if he takes a short cut across the mountain, and that just suits a chamois hunter. I have been that way before, for it leads to the home of my childhood, where, as a little boy, I lived with my grandfather, and there are shooting matches at Interlaken. I will go and try to stand first in the match. Babette will be there, and I shall be able to make her acquaintance." Carrying his light knapsack, which contained his Sunday clothes, on his back, and with his musket and his game bag over his shoulder, Rudy started to take the shortest way across the mountain. Still, it was a great distance. The shooting matches were to commence on that day, and to continue for a whole week. He had been told also that the miller and Babette would remain that time with some relatives at Interlachen. So, over the Gemmi, Rudy climbed bravely, and determined to descend the side of the Grindelwald. Bright and joyous were his feelings as he stepped lightly onwards, inhaling the invigorating mountain air. The valley sunk as he ascended. The circle of the horizon expanded. One snow-capped peak after another rose before him till the whole of the glittering alpine range became visible. Rudy knew each ice-clad peak, and he continued his course towards the Schreckhorn, with its white powdered stone finger raised high in the air. At length he had crossed the highest ridges, and before him lay the green pasture lands sloping down towards the valley, which was once his home. The buoyancy of the air made his heart light. Hill and valley were blooming in luxuriant beauty, and his thoughts were youthful dreams, in which old age or death were out of the question. Life, power, and enjoyment were in the future, and he felt free and light as a bird. And the swallows flew round him, as in the days of his childhood, singing, "We and you and we." All was overflowing with joy. Beneath him lay the meadows, covered with velvety green, with the murmuring river flowing through them, and dotted here and there were small wooden houses. He could see the edges of the glaciers looking like green glass against the soiled snow, and the deep chasms beneath the loftiest glacier. The church bells were ringing, as if to welcome him to his home with their sweet tones. His heart beat quickly, and for a moment he seemed to have forgotten Babette, so full were his thoughts of old recollections. He was, in imagination, once more wandering on the road where, when a little boy, he, with other children, came to sell their curiously carved toy houses. Yonder, behind the fir trees, still stood his grandfather's house, his mother's father. But strangers dwelt in it now. Children came running to him, as he had once done, and wished to sell their wares. One of them offered him an alpine rose. Rudy took the rose as a good omen, and thought of Babette. He quickly crossed the bridge where the two rivers flow into each other. Here he found a walk overshadowed with large walnut trees, and their thick foliage formed a pleasant shade. Very soon he perceived in the distance waving flags, on which glittered a white cross on a red ground, the standard of the Danes as well as of the Swiss, and before him lay Interlaken. "It is really a splendid town, like none other that I have ever seen," said Rudy to himself. It was indeed a Swiss town in its holiday dress, not like the many other towns, crowded with heavy stone houses, stiff and foreign-looking. No, here it seemed as if the wooden houses on the hills had run into the valley and placed themselves in rows and ranks by the side of the clear river, which rushes like an arrow in its course. The streets were rather irregular, it is true, but still this added to their picturesque appearance. There was one street which Rudy thought the prettiest of them all. It had been built since he had visited the town when a little boy. It seemed to him as if all the neatest and most curiously carved toy houses which his grandfather once kept in the large cupboard at home had been brought out and placed in this spot, and that they had increased in size since then, as the old chestnut trees had done. The houses were called hotels. The woodwork on the windows and balconies was curiously carved. The roofs were gaily painted, and before each house was a flower garden, which separated it from the macadamized high road. These houses all stood on the same side of the road, so that the fresh, green meadows, in which were cows grazing with bells on their necks, were not hidden. The sound of these bells is often heard amidst alpine scenery. These meadows were encircled by lofty hills, which receded a little in the centre, so that the most beautifully formed of Swiss mountains, the snow-crowned Jungfrau, could be distinctly seen glittering in the distance. A number of elegantly dressed gentlemen and ladies from foreign lands, and crowds of country people from the neighbouring cantons were assembled in the town. Each marksman wore the number of hits he had made twisted in a garland round his hat. Here were music and singing of all descriptions, hand organs, trumpets, shouting and noise. The houses and bridges were adorned with verses and inscriptions. Flags and banners were waving. Shot after shot was fired, which was the best music to Rudy's ears. And amidst all this excitement, he quite forgot Babette, on whose account only he had come. The shooters were thronging round the target, and Rudy was soon amongst them. But when he took his turn to fire, he proved himself the best shot, for he always struck the bull's-eye. "Who may that young stranger be?" was the inquiry on all sides. "He speaks French as it is spoken in the Swiss cantons, and makes himself understood very well when he speaks German," said some. "He lived here when a child with his grandfather in a house on the road to Grindelwald," remarked one of the sportsmen. And full of life was this young stranger. His eyes sparkled, his glance was steady, and his arm sure. Therefore he always hit the mark. Good fortune gives courage, and Rudy was always courageous. He soon had a circle of friends gathered round him. Everyone noticed him and did him homage. Babette had quite vanished from his thoughts when he was struck on the shoulder by a heavy hand, and a deep voice said to him in French, "You are from the Canton Valais." Rudy turned round and beheld a man with a ruddy, pleasant face and a stout figure. It was the rich miller from Bex. His broad, portly person hid the slender, lovely Babette, but she came forward and glanced at him with her bright, dark eyes. The rich miller was very much flattered at the thought that the young man, who was acknowledged to be the best shot and was so praised by everyone, should be from his own canton. Now was Rudy really fortunate. He had travelled all this way to this place, and those he had forgotten were now come to seek him. When country people go far from home, they often meet with those they know and improve their acquaintance. Rudy, by his shooting, had gained the first place in the shooting match, just as the miller at home at Bex stood first because of his money and his mill. So the two men shook hands, which they had never done before. Babette, too, held out her hand to Rudy frankly, and he pressed it in his, and looked at her so earnestly that she blushed deeply. The miller talked of the long journey they had travelled, and of the many towns they had seen. It was his opinion that he had really made as great a journey as if he had travelled in a steamship, a railway carriage, or a post-chaise. "I came by a much shorter way," said Rudy. "I came over the mountains. There is no road so high that a man may not venture upon it." "Ah, yes, and break your neck," said the miller. "And you look like one who will break his neck some day. You are so daring." "Oh, nothing ever happens to a man if he has confidence in himself," replied Rudy. The miller's relations at Interlaken, with whom the miller and Babette were staying, invited Rudy to visit them, when they found he came from the same canton as the miller. It was a most pleasant visit. Good fortune seemed to follow him, as it does those who think and act for themselves, and who remember the proverb, "Nuts are given to us, but they are not cracked for us." And Rudy was treated by the miller's relations almost like one of the family, and glasses of wine were poured out to drink to the welfare of the best shooter. Babette clinked glasses with Rudy, and he returned thanks for the toast. In the evening they all took a delightful walk under the walnut trees, in front of the stately hotels. There were so many people, and such crowding, that Rudy was obliged to offer his arm to Babette. Then he told her how happy it made him to meet people from the Canton Vaud, for Vaud and Valais were neighbouring cantons. He spoke of this pleasure so heartily that Babette could not resist giving his arm a slight squeeze, and so they walked on together, and talked and chatted like old acquaintances. Rudy felt inclined to laugh sometimes at the absurd dress and walk of the foreign ladies, but Babette did not wish to make fun of them, for she knew there must be some good, excellent people amongst them. She, herself, had a godmother, who was a high-born English lady. 18 years before, when Babette was christened, this lady was staying at Beck's, and she stood godmother for her, and gave her the valuable brooch she now wore in her bosom. Her godmother had twice written to her, and this year she was expected to visit Interlaken with her 2 daughters. "But they are old maids," added Babette, who was only 18. "They are nearly 30. Her sweet little mouth was never still a moment, and all that she said sounded in Rudy's ears as matters of the greatest importance. And at last he told her what he was longing to tell. How often he had been at Beck's, how well he knew the mill, and how often he had seen Babette, when most likely she had not noticed him. And lastly, that full of many thoughts which he could not tell her, he had been to the mill on the evening when she and her father had started on their long journey, but not too far for him to find a way to overtake them. He told her all this, and a great deal more. He told her how much he could endure for her, and that it was to see her, and not the shooting match, which had brought him to Interlaken. Babette became quite silent after hearing all this. It was almost too much, and it troubled her. And while they thus wandered on, the sun sunk behind the lofty mountains. The Jungfrau stood out in brightness and splendour as a background to the green woods of the surrounding hills. Everyone stood still to look at the beautiful sight, Rudy and Babette among them. "Nothing can be more beautiful than this," said Babette. "Nothing," replied Rudy, looking at Babette. "Tomorrow I must return home," remarked Rudy a few minutes afterwards. "Come and visit us at Beck's," whispered Babette. "My father will be pleased to see you." Oh, what a number of things Rudy had to carry over the mountains when he set out to return home. He had 3 silver cups, 2 handsome pistols, and a silver coffee-pot. This latter would be useful when he began housekeeping, but all these were not the heaviest weight he had to bear. Something mightier and more important he carried with him in his heart over the high mountains as he journeyed homeward. The weather was dismally dark and inclined to rain. The clouds hung low like a morning veil on the tops of the mountains and shrouded their glittering peaks. In the woods could be heard the sound of the axe and the heavy fall of the trunks of the trees as they rolled down the slopes of the mountains. When seen from the heights, the trunks of these trees looked like slender stems, but on a nearer inspection they were found to be large and strong enough for the masts of a ship. The river murmured monotonously, the wind whistled, and the clouds sailed along hurriedly. Suddenly there appeared, close by Rudy's side, a young maiden. He had not noticed her till she came quite near to him. She was also going to ascend the mountain. The maiden's eyes shone with an unearthly power, which obliged you to look into them. They were strange eyes, clear, deep, and unfathomable. "Hast thou a lover?" asked Rudy. All his thoughts were naturally on love just then. "I have none," answered the maiden with a laugh. It was as if she had not spoken the truth. "Do not let us go such a long way round," said she. "We must keep to the left. It is much shorter." "Ah, yes," he replied, "and fall into some crevasse. Do you pretend to be a guide and not know the road better than that?" "I know every step of the way," said she, "and my thoughts are collected while yours are down in the valley yonder. We should think of the Ice Maiden while we are up here. Men say she is not kind to their race." "I fear her not," said Rudy. "She could not keep me when I was a child. I will not give myself up to her now. I am a man." Darkness came on, the rain fell, and then it began to snow, and the whiteness dazzled the eyes. "Give me your hand," said the maiden. "I will help you to mount." And he felt the touch of her icy fingers. "You help me," cried Rudy. I do not yet require a woman to help me to climb." And he stepped quickly forwards, away from her. The drifting snow shower fell like a veil between them. The wind whistled, and behind him he could hear the maiden laughing and singing, and the sound was most strange to hear. It certainly must be a spectre or a servant of the Ice Maiden, thought Rudy, who had heard such things talked about when he was a little boy and had stayed all night on the mountain with the guides. The snow fell thicker than ever. The clouds lay beneath him. He looked back. There was no one to be seen, but he heard sounds of mocking laughter, which were not those of a human voice. When Rudy at length reached the highest part of the mountain, where the path led down to the valley of the Rhone, the snow had ceased, and in the clear heavens he saw 2 bright stars twinkling. They reminded him of Babette and of himself, and of his future happiness, and his heart glowed at the thought. "What beautiful things you have brought home," said his old foster-mother, and her strange-looking eagle eyes sparkled, while she wriggled and twisted her skinny neck more quickly and strangely than ever. "You have brought good luck with you, Rudy. I must give you a kiss, my dear boy." Rudy allowed himself to be kissed, but it could be seen by his countenance that he only endured the infliction as a homely duty. "How handsome you are, Rudy," said the old woman. "Don't flatter," said Rudy, with a laugh, but still he was pleased.
I must say once more, said the old woman, that you are very lucky.
"Well, in that I believe you are right," said he, as he thought of Babette. Never had he felt such a longing for that deep valley as he now had. "They must have returned home by this time," said he to himself. "It is already 2 days over the time which they fixed upon. I must go to Beck's." So Rudy set out to go to Beck's, and when he arrived there, he found the miller and his daughter at home. They received him kindly, and brought him many greetings from their friends at Interlachen. Babette did not say much. She seemed to have become quite silent, but her eyes spoke, and that was quite enough for Rudy. The miller had generally a great deal to talk about, and seemed to expect that everyone should listen to his jokes, and laugh at them, for was not he the rich miller? But now he was more inclined to hear Rudy's adventures while hunting and travelling, and to listen to his descriptions of the difficulties the chamois hunter has to overcome on the mountain tops, or of the dangerous snowdrifts which the wind and weather cause to cling to the edges of the rocks, or to lie in the form of a frail bridge over the abyss beneath. The eyes of the brave Rudy sparkled as he described the life of a hunter, or spoke of the cunning of the chamois and their wonderful leaps, also of the powerful foam and the rolling avalanche. He noticed that the more he described, the more interested the miller became, especially when he spoke of the fierce vulture and of the royal eagle. Not far from Bex, in the Canton Valais, was an eagle's nest, more curiously built under a high, overhanging rock. In this nest was a young eagle, but who would venture to take it? A young Englishman had offered Rudy a whole handful of gold if he would bring him the young eagle alive. "There is a limit to everything," was Rudy's reply. "The eagle could not be taken. It would be folly to attempt it." The wine was passed round freely, and the conversation kept up pleasantly, but the evening seemed too short for Rudy. Although it was midnight when he left the miller's house, after this his first visit, while the lights in the windows of the miller's house still twinkled through the green foliage, out through the open skylight came the parlour cat onto the roof, and along the water-pipe walked the kitchen cat to meet her. "What is the news at the mill?" asked the parlour cat. "Here in the house there is secret love-making going on, which the father knows nothing about. Rudy and Babette have been treading on each other's paws under the table all the evening. They trod on my tail twice, but I did not mew. That would have attracted notice." "Well, I should have mewed," said the kitchen cat. What might suit the kitchen would not suit the parlour, said the other. I am quite curious to know what the miller will say when he finds out this engagement. Yes, indeed, what would the miller say? Rudy himself was anxious to know that, but to wait till the miller heard of it from others was out of the question. Therefore, not many days after this visit, he was riding in the omnibus that runs between the two cantons, Valais and Vaud. These cantons are separated by the Rhone, over which is a bridge that unites them. Rudy, as usual, had plenty of courage and indulged in pleasant thoughts of the favourable answer he should receive that evening. And when the omnibus returned, Rudy was again seated in it, going homewards, and at the same time the parlour cat at the miller's house ran out quickly, crying, "Here, you from the kitchen, what do you think? The miller knows all now. Everything has come to a delightful end. Rudy came here this evening, and he and Babette had much whispering and secret conversation together. They stood in the path near the miller's room. I lay at their feet, but they had no eyes or thoughts for me. I will go to your father at once, said he. It is the most honourable way. Shall I go with you? Asked Babette. It will give you courage. I have plenty of courage, said Rudy. But if you are with me, he must be friendly, whether he says yes or no. So they turned to go in, and Rudy trod heavily on my tail. He certainly is very clumsy. I mewed, but neither he nor Babette had any ears for me. They opened the door and entered together. I was before them, and jumped on the back of a chair. I hardly know what Rudy said, but the miller flew into a rage and threatened to kick him out of the house. He told him he might go to the mountains and look after the chamois, but not after our little Babette. And what did they say? Did they speak? Asked the kitchen cat. What did they say? Why, all that people generally do say when they go a-wooing. I love her, and she loves me. And when there is milk in the can for one, there is milk in the can for two. But she is so far above you, said the miller. She has heaps of gold, as you know. You should not attempt to reach her. There is nothing so high that a man cannot reach, if he will, answered Rudy, for he is a brave youth. Yet you could not reach the young eagle, said the miller, laughing. Babette is higher than the eagle's nest. I will have them both, said Rudy. Very well. I will give her to you when you bring me the young eaglet alive, said the miller, and he laughed till the tears stood in his eyes. But now I thank you for this visit, Rudy, and if you come tomorrow, you will find nobody at home. Goodbye, Rudy. Babette also wished him farewell, but her voice sounded as mournful as the mew of a little kitten that has lost its mother. A promise is a promise between man and man, said Rudy. Do not weep, Babette. I shall bring the young eagle. You will break your neck, I hope, said the miller, and we shall be relieved from your company. I call that kicking him out of the house, said the parlour cat. And now Rudy is gone, and Babette sits and weeps, while the miller sings German songs that he learnt on his journey, but I do not trouble myself on the matter. It would be of no use. Yet, for all that, it is a very strange affair, said the kitchen cat. From the mountain path came a joyous sound of some person whistling, and it betokened good humour and undaunted courage. It was Rudy, going to meet his friend Vesinord. You must come and help, said he. I want to carry off the young eaglet from the top of the rock. We will take young Ragley with us. Had you not better first try to take down the moon? That would be quite as easy a task, said Vesinord. You seem to be in good spirits. Yes, indeed I am. I am thinking of my wedding. But to be serious, I will tell you all about it, and how I am situated. Then he explained to Vesinord and Ragley what he wished to do and why. You are a daring fellow, said they, But it is no use. You will break your neck." "No one falls unless he is afraid," said Rudy. So at midnight they set out, carrying with them poles, ladders, and ropes. The road lay amidst brushwood and underwood over rolling stones, always upwards higher and higher in the dark night. Waters roared beneath them, or fell in cascades from above. Humid clouds were driving through the air as the hunters reached the precipitous ledge of the rock. It was even darker here, for the sides of the rocks almost met, and the light penetrated only through a small opening at the top. At a little distance from the edge could be heard the sound of the roaring, foaming waters in the yawning abyss beneath them. The three seated themselves on a stone to await in stillness the dawn of day, when the parent eagle would fly out, as it would be necessary to shoot the old bird before they could think of gaining possession of the young one. Rudy sat motionless, as if he had been part of the stone on which he sat. He held his gun ready to fire, with his eyes fixed steadily on the highest point of the cliff, where the eagle's nest lay concealed beneath the overhanging rock. The three hunters had a long time to wait. At last they heard a rustling, whirring sound above them, and a large, hovering object darkened the air. 2 guns were ready to aim at the dark body of the eagle as it rose from the nest. Then a shot was fired. For an instant the bird fluttered its wide-spreading wings, and seemed as if it would fill up the whole of the chasm and drag down the hunters in its fall. But it was not so. The eagle sunk gradually into the abyss beneath, and the branches of trees and bushes were broken by its weight. Then the hunters roused themselves. 3 of the longest ladders were brought and bound together. The topmost ring of these ladders would just reach the edge of the rock which hung over the abyss, but no farther. The point beneath which the eagle's nest lay sheltered was much higher, and the sides of the rock were as smooth as a wall. After consulting together, they determined to bind together 2 more ladders and to hoist them over the cavity, and so form a communication with the 3 beneath them by binding the upper ones to the lower. With great difficulty they contrived to drag the 2 ladders over the rock, and there they hung for some moments, swaying over the abyss. But no sooner had they fastened them together than Rudy placed his foot on the lowest step. It was a bitterly cold morning. Clouds of mist were rising from beneath, and Rudy stood on the lowest step of the ladder as a fly rests on a piece of swinging straw, which a bird may have dropped from the edge of the nest it was building on some tall factory chimney. But the fly could fly away if the straw were shaken. Rudy could only break his neck. The wind whistled around him, and beneath him the waters of the abyss swelled by the thawing of the glaciers. Those palaces of the Ice Maiden foamed and roared in their rapid course. When Rudy began to ascend, the ladder trembled like the web of the spider when it draws out the long, delicate threads. But as soon as he reached the 4th of the ladders, which had been bound together, he felt more confidence. He knew that they had been fastened securely by skillful hands. The 5th ladder, that appeared to reach the nest, was supported by the sides of the rock, yet it swung to and fro and flapped about like a slender reed, and as if it had been bound by fishing lines. It seemed a most dangerous undertaking to ascend it, but Rudy knew how to climb. He had learnt that from the cat, and he had no fear. He did not observe Vertigo, who stood in the air behind him, trying to lay hold of him with his outstretched polypus arms. When at length he stood on the topmost step of the ladder, he found that he was still some distance below the nest, and not even able to see into it. Only by using his hands and climbing could he possibly reach it. He tried the strength of the stunted trees and the thick underwood upon which the nest rested, and of which it was formed, and finding they would support his weight, he grasped them firmly, and swung himself up from the ladder till his head and breast were above the nest. And then what an overpowering stench came from it! for in it lay the putrid remains of lambs, chamois, and birds. Vertigo, although he could not reach him, blew the poisonous vapour in his face to make him giddy and faint. And beneath, in the dark, yawning deep, on the rushing waters, sat the Ice Maiden, with her long, pale green hair falling around her, and her death-like eyes fixed upon him, like the two barrels of a gun. "I have thee now!" she cried. In a corner of the eagle's nest sat the young eaglet, a large and powerful bird, though still unable to fly. Rudy fixed his eyes upon it, held on by one hand with all his strength, and with the other threw a noose round the young eagle. The string slipped to its legs. Rudy tightened it, and thus secured the bird alive. Then, flinging the sling over his shoulder, so that the creature hung a good way down behind him, he prepared to descend with the help of a rope, and his foot soon touched safely the highest step of the ladder. Then Rudy, remembering his early lesson in climbing, "Hold fast and do not fear," descended carefully down the ladders, and at last stood safely on the ground with the young living eaglet, where he was received with loud shouts of joy and congratulations. "There is what you asked for," said Rudy, as he entered the miller's house at Beck's and placed on the floor a large basket. He removed the lid as he spoke, and a pair of yellow eyes, encircled by a black ring, stared forth with a wild, fiery glance that seemed ready to burn and destroy all that came in its way. Its short, strong beak was open, ready to bite, and on its red throat were short feathers like stubble. "The young eaglet!" cried the miller. Babette screamed and started back, while her eyes wandered from Rudy to the bird in astonishment. "You are not to be discouraged by difficulties, I see," said the miller. "And you will keep your word," replied Rudy. "Each has his own characteristic, whether it is honour or courage." "But how is it you did not break your neck?" asked the miller. "Because I held fast," answered Rudy, "and I mean to hold fast to Babette." "You must get her first," said the miller, laughing, and Babette thought this a very good sign. "We must take the bird out of the basket," said she. "It is getting into a rage how its eyes glare. How did you manage to conquer it?" Then Rudy had to describe his adventure, and the miller's eyes opened wide as he listened. "With your courage and your good fortune, you might win 3 wives," said the miller. "Oh, thank you," cried Rudy. "But you have not won Babette yet," said the miller, slapping the young alpine hunter on the shoulder playfully. "Have you heard the fresh news at the mill?" asked the parlour cat of the kitchen cat. "Rudy has brought us the young eagle, and he is to take Babette in exchange." They kissed each other in the presence of the old man, which is as good as an engagement. He was quite civil about it, drew in his claws, and took his afternoon nap, so that the two were left to sit and wag their tails as much as they pleased. They have so much to talk about that it will not be finished till Christmas. Neither was it finished till Christmas. The wind whirled the faded fallen leaves, the snow drifted in the valleys, as well as upon the mountains, and the Ice Maiden sat in the stately palace which, in winter-time, she generally occupied. The perpendicular rocks were covered with slippery ice, and where in summer the stream from the rocks had left a watery veil, icicles large and heavy hung from the trees, while the snow-powdered fir trees were decorated with fantastic garlands of crystal. The Ice Maiden rode on the howling wind across the deep valleys. The country, as far as Beck's, was covered with a carpet of snow, so that the Ice Maiden could follow Rudy and see him when he visited the mill. And while in the room at the miller's house, where he was accustomed to spend so much of his time with Babette, the wedding was to take place in the following summer, and they heard enough of it, for so many of their friends spoke of the matter. Then came sunshine to the mill. The beautiful alpine roses bloomed, and joyous, laughing Babette was like the early spring, which makes all the birds sing of summertime and bridal days. "How those two do sit and chatter together," said the parlour cat. "I have had enough of their mewing. The walnut and chestnut trees, which extend from the bridge of Saint Maurice, by the river Rhone, to the shores of the Lake of Geneva, were already covered with the delicate green garlands of early spring, just bursting into bloom, while the Rhone rushed wildly from its source among the green glaciers which form the ice palace of the Ice Maiden. She sometimes allows herself to be carried by the keen wind to the lofty snow fields, where she stretches herself in the sunshine on the soft, snowy cushions. From thence she throws her far-seeing glance into the deep valley beneath, where human beings are busily moving about like ants on a stone in the sun." "Spirits of strength, as the children of the sun call you," cried the Ice Maiden, "ye are but worms. Let but a snowball roll, and you and your houses and your towns are crushed and swept away." And she raised her proud head and looked around her with eyes that flashed death from their glance. From the valley came a rumbling sound. Men were busily at work blasting the rocks to form tunnels and laying down roads for the railway. "They are playing at work underground." "Like moles," said she. "They are digging passages beneath the earth, and the noise is like the reports of cannons. I shall throw down my palaces, for the clamour is louder than the roar of thunder." Then there ascended from the valley a thick vapour, which waved itself in the air like a fluttering veil. It rose, as a plume of feathers, from a steam engine to which, on the lately opened railway, a string of carriages was linked, carriage to carriage, looking like a winding serpent. The train shot past with the speed of an arrow. "They play at being masters down there, those spirits of strength," exclaimed the Ice Maiden. "But the powers of nature are still the rulers." And she laughed and sang till her voice sounded through the valley, and people said it was the rolling of an avalanche. But the children of the sun sang in louder strains in praise of the mind of man, which can span the sea as with a yoke, can level mountains, and fill up valleys. It is the power of thought which gives man the mastery over nature. Just at this moment, they came across the snowfield where the Ice Maiden sat, a party of travellers. They had bound themselves fast to each other, so that they looked like one large body on the slippery plains of ice encircling the deep abyss. "Worms!" exclaimed the Ice Maiden. "You, the lords of the powers of nature!" And she turned away and looked maliciously at the deep valley where the railway train was rushing by. "There they sit, these thoughts," she exclaimed. "There they sit in their power over nature's strength. I see them all. One sits proudly apart, like a king. Others sit together in the group. Yonder, half of them are asleep, and when the steam dragon stops, they will get out and go their way. The thoughts go forth into the world." And she laughed. "There goes another avalanche," said those in the valley beneath. "It will not reach us," said two who sat together behind the steam dragon. "Two hearts and one beat," as people say. They were Rudy and Babette, and the miller was with them. "I am like the luggage," said he. "I am here as a necessary appendage." "There sit those two," said the Ice Maiden. "Many a chamois have I crushed. Millions of alpine roses have I snapped and broken off. Not a root have I spared. I know them all, and their thoughts, those spirits of strength." And again she laughed. "There rolls another avalanche," said those in the valley. At Montreux, one of the towns which encircle the northeast part of the Lake of Geneva, lived Babette's godmother, the noble English lady, with her daughters and a young relative. They had only lately arrived, yet the miller had paid them a visit, and informed them of Babette's engagement to Rudy. The whole story of their meeting at Interlachen, and his brave adventure with the eaglet were related to them, and they were all very much interested, and as pleased about Rudy and Babette as the miller himself. The three were invited to come to Montreux. It was but right for Babette to become acquainted with her godmother, who wished to see her very much. A steamboat started from the town of Villeneuve at one end of the Lake of Geneva and arrived at Bernex, a little town beyond Montreux, in about half an hour. And in this boat, the miller, with his daughter and Rudy, set out to visit her godmother. They passed the coast, which has been so celebrated in song. Here, under the walnut trees, by the deep blue lake, sat Byron, and wrote his melodious verses about the prisoner confined in the gloomy castle of Chillon. Here, where Clarence, with its weeping willows, is reflected in the clear water, wandered Rousseau, dreaming of Heloise. The river Rhône glides gently by beneath the lofty snow-capped hills of Savoy, and not far from its mouth lies a little island in the lake, so small that, seen from the shore, it looks like a ship. The surface of the island is rocky, and about 100 years ago a lady caused the ground to be covered with earth, in which 3 acacia trees were planted, and the whole enclosed with stone walls. The acacia trees now overshadow every part of the island. Babette was enchanted with the spot. It seemed to her the most beautiful object in the whole voyage, and she thought how much she should like to land there. But the steamship passed it by, and did not stop till it reached Bernex. The little party walked slowly from this place to Montreux, passing the sunlit walls with which the vineyards of the little mountain town of Montreux are surrounded, and peasants' houses overshadowed by fig trees, with gardens in which grow the laurel and the cypress. Halfway up the hill stood the boarding-house in which Babette's godmother resided. She was received most cordially. Her godmother was a very friendly woman, with a round, smiling countenance. When a child, her head must have resembled one of Raphael's cherubs. It was still an angelic face, with its white locks of silvery hair. The daughters were tall, elegant, slender maidens. The young cousin, whom they had brought with them, was dressed in white from head to foot. He had golden hair and golden whiskers, large enough to be divided amongst 3 gentlemen, and he began immediately to pay the greatest attention to Babette. Richly bound books, note-paper and drawings lay on the large table. The balcony window stood open, and from it could be seen the beautiful wide extended lake, the water so clear and still that the mountains of Savoy, with their villages, woods, and snow-crowned peaks, were clearly reflected in it. Rudy, who was usually so lively and brave, did not in the least feel himself at home. He acted as if he were walking on peas over a slippery floor. How long and wearisome the time appeared! It was like being in a treadmill. And then they went out for a walk, which was very slow and tedious. 2 steps forward and 1 backwards had Rudy to take to keep pace with the others. They walked down to Chillon and went over the old castle on the rocky island. They saw the implements of torture, the deadly dungeons, the rusty fetters in the rocky walls, the stone benches for those condemned to death, the trap-doors through which the unhappy creatures were hurled upon iron spikes and impaled alive. They called looking at all these a pleasure. It certainly was the right place to visit. Byron's poetry had made it celebrated in the world. Rudy could only feel that it was a place of execution. He leaned against the stone framework of the window and gazed down into the deep blue water and over to the little island with the 3 acacias, and wished himself there, away and free from the whole chattering party. But Babette was most unusually lively and good-tempered. "I have been so amused," she said. The cousin had found her quite perfect. "He is a perfect fop," said Rudy, and this was the first time Rudy had said anything that did not please Babette. The Englishman had made her a present of a little book in remembrance of their visit to Chillon. It was Byron's poem, The Prisoner of Chillon, translated into French, so that Babette could read it. "The book may be very good," said Rudy, "but that finely combed fellow who gave it to you is not worth much." "He looks something like a flour sack without any flour," said the miller, laughing at his own wit. Rudy laughed too, for so had he appeared to him. When Rudy went a few days after to pay a visit to the mill, he found the young Englishman there. Babette was just thinking of preparing some trout to set before him. She understood well how to garnish the dish with parsley and make it look quite tempting. Rudy thought all this quite unnecessary. What did the Englishman want there? What was he about? Why should he be entertained and waited upon by Babette? Rudy was jealous, and that made Babette happy. It amused her to discover all the feelings of his heart, the strong points and weak ones. Love was to her as yet only a pastime, and she played with Rudy's whole heart. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that her fortune, her whole life, her inmost thoughts, her best and most noble feelings in this world were all for him. Still, the more gloomy he looked, the more her eyes laughed. She could almost have kissed the fair Englishman with the golden whiskers, if by so doing she could have put Rudy in a rage and made him run out of the house. That would have proved how much he loved her. All this was not right in Babette, but she was only 19 years of age, and she did not reflect on what she did, neither did she think that her conduct would appear to the young Englishman as light, and not even becoming the modest and much-loved daughter of the miller. The mill at Bex stood in the highway which passed under the snow-clad mountains and not far from a rapid mountain stream, whose waters seemed to have been lashed into a foam like soap-suds. This stream, however, did not pass near enough to the mill, and therefore the mill wheel was turned by a smaller stream which tumbled down the rocks on the opposite side, where it was opposed by a stone mill dam, and obtained greater strength and speed, till it fell into a large basin, and from thence through a channel to the mill wheel. This channel sometimes overflowed, and made the path so slippery that anyone passing that way might easily fall in and be carried towards the mill wheel with frightful rapidity. Such a catastrophe nearly happened to the young Englishman. He had dressed himself in white clothes like a miller's man, and was climbing the path to the miller's house. But he had never been taught to climb, and therefore slipped and nearly went in head foremost. He managed, however, to scramble out with wet sleeves and bespattered trousers. Still, wet and splashed with mud, he contrived to reach Babette's window, to which he had been guided by the light that shone from it. Here he climbed the old linden tree that stood near it, and began to imitate the voice of an owl, the only bird he could venture to mimic. Babette heard the noise, and glanced through the thin window curtain, but when she saw the man in white and guessed who he was, her little heart beat with terror as well as anger. She quickly put out the light, felt if the fastening of the window was secure, and then left him to howl as long as he liked. How dreadful it would be, thought Babette, if Rudy were here in the house. But Rudy was not in the house. No, it was much worse. He was outside, standing just under the linden tree. He was speaking loud, angry words. He could fight, and there might be murder. Babette opened the window in alarm and called Rudy's name. She told him to go away. She did not wish him to remain there. "You do not wish me to stay," cried he. "Then this is an appointment you expected, this good friend whom you prefer to me." "Shame on you, Babette. You are detestable," exclaimed Babette, bursting into tears. "Go away. I hate you." "I have not deserved this," said Rudy, as he turned away, his cheeks burning, and his heart like fire. Babette threw herself on the bed and wept bitterly. So much as I loved thee, Rudy, and yet thou canst think ill of me." Thus her anger broke forth. It relieved her, however, otherwise she would have been more deeply grieved. But now she could sleep soundly, as youth only can sleep. Rudy left Bex and took his way home along the mountain path. The air was fresh but cold, for here, amidst the deep snow, the Ice Maiden reigned. He was so high up that the large trees beneath him, with their thick foliage, appeared like garden plants, and the pines and bushes even less. The alpine roses grew near the snow, which lay in detached stripes and looked like linen laid out to bleach. A blue gentian grew in his path, and he crushed it with the butt end of his gun. A little higher up he espied 2 chamois. Rudy's eyes glistened, and his thoughts flew at once in a different direction, but he was not near enough to take a sure aim. He ascended still higher to a spot where a few rough blades of grass grew between the blocks of stone, and the chamois passed quietly on over the snowfields. Rudy walked hurriedly, while the clouds of mist gathered round him. Suddenly he found himself on the brink of a precipitous rock. The rain was falling in torrents. He felt a burning thirst. His head was hot, and his limbs trembled with cold. He seized his hunting flask, but it was empty. He had not thought of filling it before ascending the mountain. He had never been ill in his life, nor ever experienced such sensations as those he now felt. He was so tired that he could scarcely resist lying down at his full length to sleep, although the ground was flooded with the rain. Yet when he tried to rouse himself a little, every object around him danced and trembled before his eyes. Suddenly he observed in the doorway of a hut newly built under the rock a young maiden. He did not remember having seen this hut before, yet there it stood, and he thought, at first, that the young maiden was Annette, the schoolmaster's daughter, whom he had once kissed in the dance. The maiden was not Annette, yet it seemed as if he had seen her somewhere before, perhaps near Grindelwald, on the evening of his return home from Interlaken after the shooting match. "How did you come here?" he asked. "I am at home," she replied. "I am watching my flocks." "Your flocks?" he exclaimed. "Where do they find pasture? There is nothing here but snow and rocks." "Much you know of what grows here," she replied, laughing. "Not far beneath us there is beautiful pasture land. My goats go there. I tend them carefully. I never miss one. What is once mine remains mine." "You are bold," said Rudy. "And so are you," she answered. "Have you any milk in the house?" he asked. "If so, give me some to drink. My thirst is intolerable." "I have something better than milk," she replied, "which I will give you. Some travellers who were here yesterday with their guide left behind them half a flask of wine, such as you have never tasted. They will not come back to fetch it, I know, and I shall not drink it, so you shall have it." Then the maiden went to fetch the wine, poured some into a wooden cup, and offered it to Rudy. "How good it is," said he. "I have never before tasted such warm, invigorating wine." And his eyes sparkled with new life. A glow diffused itself over his frame. It seemed as if every sorrow, every oppression were banished from his mind, and a fresh, free nature was stirring within him. "You are surely Annette, the schoolmaster's daughter," cried he. "Will you give me a kiss?" "Yes, if you will give me that beautiful ring which you wear on your finger." "My betrothal ring," he replied. "Yes, just so," said the maiden, as she poured out some more wine and held it to his lips. Again he drank, and a living joy streamed through every vein. "The whole world is mine. Why, therefore, should I grieve?" thought he. "Everything is created for our enjoyment and happiness. The stream of life is a stream of happiness. Let us flow on with it to joy and felicity." Rudy gazed on the young maiden. It was Annette, and yet it was not Annette. Still less did he suppose it was the spectral phantom whom he had met near Grindelwald. The maiden up here on the mountain was fresh as the new fallen snow, blooming as an alpine rose, and as nimble-footed as a young kid. Still, she was one of Adam's race, like Rudy. He flung his arms round the beautiful being and gazed into her wonderfully clear eyes, only for a moment. But in that moment, words cannot express the effect of his gaze. Was it the spirit of life or of death that overpowered him? Was he rising higher or sinking lower and lower into the deep, deadly abyss? He knew not, but the walls of ice shone like blue-green glass, innumerable clefts yawned around him, and the water drops tinkled like the chiming of church bells, and shone clearly as pearls in the light of a pale blue flame. The Ice Maiden, for she it was, kissed him, and her kiss sent a chill as of ice through his whole frame. A cry of agony escaped from him. He struggled to get free and tottered from her. For a moment all was dark before his eyes, but when he opened them again it was light, and the Alpine maiden had vanished. The powers of evil had played their game. The sheltering hut was no more to be seen. The water trickled down the naked sides of the rocks, and snow lay thickly all around. Rudy shivered with cold. He was wet through to the skin, and his ring was gone, the betrothal ring that Babette had given him. His gun lay near him in the snow. He took it up and tried to discharge it, but it missed fire. Heavy clouds lay on the mountain clefts, like firm masses of snow. Upon one of these Vertigo sat, lurking after his powerless prey, and from beneath came a sound as if a piece of rock had fallen from the cleft, and was crushing everything that stood in its way or opposed its course. But at the miller's, Babette sat alone and wept. Rudy had not been to see her for 6 days, he who was in the wrong and who ought to ask her forgiveness, for did she not love him with her whole heart? "What strange creatures human beings are," said the parlour cat to the kitchen cat. "Babette and Rudy have fallen out with each other. She sits and cries, and he thinks no more about her." "That does not please me to hear," said the kitchen cat. "Nor me either," replied the parlour cat, "but I do not take it to heart. Babette may fall in love with the red whiskers, if she likes, but he has not been here since he tried to get on the roof. The powers of evil carry on their game both around us and within us." Rudy knew this, and thought a great deal about it. What was it that had happened to him on the mountain? Was it really a ghostly apparition, or a fever dream? Rudy knew nothing of fever, or any other ailment. But, while he judged Babette, he began to examine his own conduct. He had allowed wild thoughts to chase each other in his heart, and a fierce tornado to break loose. Could he confess to Babette indeed every thought which in the hour of temptation might have led him to wrongdoing? He had lost her ring, and that very loss had won him back to her. Could she expect him to confess? He felt as if his heart would break while he thought of it, and while so many memories lingered on his mind. He saw her again, as she once stood before him, a laughing, spirited child, many loving words, which she had spoken to him out of the fullness of her love, came like a ray of sunshine into his heart, and soon it was all sunshine as he thought of Babette. But she must also confess she was wrong, that she should do. He went to the mill. He went to confession. It began with a kiss, and ended with Rudy being considered the offender. It was such a great fault to doubt Babette's truth. It was most abominable of him. Such mistrust, such violence, would cause them both great unhappiness. This certainly was very true. She knew that, and therefore Babette preached him a little sermon with which she was herself much amused, and during the preaching of which she looked quite lovely. She acknowledged, however, that on one point Rudy was right. Her godmother's nephew was a fop. She intended to burn the book which he had given her, so that not the slightest thing should remain to remind her of him. "Well, that quarrel is all over," said the kitchen cat. "Rudy is come back, and they are friends again, which they say is the greatest of all pleasures." "I heard the rat say one night," said the kitchen cat, "that the greatest pleasure in the world was to eat tallow candles and to feast on rancid bacon. Which are we to believe, the rats or the lovers?" "Neither of them," said the parlour cat. "It is always the safest plan to believe nothing you hear." The greatest happiness was coming for Rudy and Babette. The happy day, as it is called, that is, their wedding day, was near at hand. They were not to be married at the church at Beck's, nor at the miller's house. Babette's godmother wished the nuptials to be solemnized at Montreux, in the pretty little church in that town. The miller was very anxious that this arrangement should be agreed to. He alone knew what the newly married couple would receive from Babette's godmother, and he knew also that it was a wedding present well worth a concession. The day was fixed, and they were to travel as far as Villeneuve the evening before, to be in time for the steamer which sailed in the morning for Montreux, and the godmother's daughters were to dress and adorn the bride. "Here in this house there ought to be a wedding day kept," said the parlour cat, "or else I would not give a mew for the whole affair." "There is going to be great feasting," replied the kitchen cat. "Ducks and pigeons have been killed, and a whole roebuck hangs on the wall. It makes me lick my lips when I think of it. Tomorrow morning they will begin the journey." "Yes, tomorrow." And this evening, for the last time, Rudy and Babette sat in the miller's house as an engaged couple. Outside, the Alps glowed in the evening sunset. The evening bells chimed, and the children of the sunbeam sang, "Whatever happens is best." The sun had gone down, and the clouds lay low on the valley of the Rhone. The wind blew from the south across the mountains. It was an African wind, a wind which scattered the clouds for a moment, and then suddenly fell. The broken clouds hung in fantastic forms upon the wood-covered hills by the rapid Rhone. They assumed the shapes of antediluvian animals, of eagles hovering in the air, of frogs leaping over a marsh, and then sunk down upon the rushing stream and appeared to sail upon it, although floating in the air. An uprooted fir tree was being carried away by the current, and marking out its path by eddying circles on the water. Vertigo and his sisters were dancing upon it, and raising these circles on the foaming river. The moon lighted up the snow on the mountain tops, shone on the dark woods, and on the drifting clouds, those fantastic forms which at night might be taken for spirits of the powers of nature. The mountain dweller saw them through the panes of his little window. They sailed in hosts before the Ice Maiden as she came out of her palace of ice. Then she seated herself on the trunk of the fir tree as on a broken skiff, and the water from the glaciers carried her down the river to the open lake. "The wedding guests are coming," sounded from air and sea. These were the sights and sounds without. Within there were visions, for Babette had a wonderful dream. She dreamt that she had been married to Rudy for many years, and that one day when he was out chamois hunting, and she alone in their dwelling at home, the young Englishman with the golden whiskers sat with her. His eyes were quite eloquent, and his words possessed a magic power. He offered her his hand, and she was obliged to follow him. They went out of the house and stepped downwards, always downwards, and it seemed to Babette as if she had a weight on her heart which continually grew heavier. She felt she was committing a sin against Rudy, a sin against God. Suddenly she found herself forsaken, her clothes torn by the thorns and her hair grey. She looked upwards in her agony, and there, on the edge of the rock, she espied Rudy. She stretched out her arms to him, but she did not venture to call him or to pray, and had she called him it would have been useless, for it was not Rudy. only his hunting coat and hat hanging on an alpenstock, as the hunters sometimes arrange them to deceive the chamois. "Oh!" she exclaimed in her agony. "Oh, that I had died on the happiest day of my life, my wedding day. Oh, my God, it would have been a mercy and a blessing had Rudy travelled far away from me, and I had never known him. None know what will happen in the future." And then, in ungodly despair, she cast herself down into the deep, rocky gulf. The spell was broken. A cry of terror escaped her, and she awoke. The dream was over. It had vanished. But she knew she had dreamt something frightful about the young Englishman. Yet months had passed since she had seen him or even thought of him. Was he still at Montreux, and should she meet him there on her wedding day? A slight shadow passed over her pretty mouth as she thought of this, and she knit her brows, but the smile soon returned to her lip, and joy sparkled in her eyes. For this was the morning of the day on which she and Rudy were to be married, and the sun was shining brightly. Rudy was already in the parlour when she entered it, and they very soon started for Villeneuve. Both of them were overflowing with happiness, and the miller was in the best of tempers, laughing and merry. He was a good, honest soul, and a kind father. "Now we are masters of the house," said the parlour cat. It was early in the afternoon, and just at dinner time, when the three joyous travellers reached Villeneuve. After dinner, the miller placed himself in the armchair, smoked his pipe, and had a little nap. The bridal pair went arm in arm out through the town and along the high road at the foot of the wood-covered rocks and by the deep blue lake. The grey walls and the heavy, clumsy-looking towers of the gloomy castle of Chillon were reflected in the clear flood. The little island on which grew the three acacias lay at a short distance, looking like a bouquet rising from the lake. "How delightful it must be to live there," said Babette, who again felt the greatest wish to visit the island, and an opportunity offered to gratify her wish at once, for on the shore lay a boat, and the rope by which it was moored could be very easily loosened. They saw no one near, so they took possession of it without asking permission of anyone, and Rudy could row very well. The oars divided the pliant water like the fins of a fish, that water which, with all its yielding softness, is so strong to bear and to carry, so mild and smiling when at rest, and yet so terrible in its destroying power. A white streak of foam followed in the wake of the boat, which, in a few minutes, carried them both to the little island, where they went on shore. But there was only just room enough for two to dance. Rudy swung Babette round 2 or 3 times, and then, hand in hand, they sat down on a little bench under the drooping acacia tree and looked into each other's eyes, while everything around them glowed in the rays of the setting sun. The fir-tree forests on the mountains were covered with a purple hue like the heather bloom, and where the woods terminated and the rocks became prominent, they looked almost transparent in the rich crimson glow of the evening sky. The surface of the lake was like a bed of pink rose leaves. As the evening advanced, the shadows fell upon the snow-capped mountains of Savoy, painting them in colours of deep blue, while their topmost peaks glowed like red lava, and, for a moment, this light was reflected on the cultivated parts of the mountains, making them appear as if newly risen from the lap of earth, and giving to the snow-crested peak of the Dent du Midi the appearance of the full moon as it rises above the horizon. Rudy and Babette felt that they had never seen the alpine glow in such perfection before. "How very beautiful it is, and what happiness to be here!" exclaimed Babette. "Earth has nothing more to bestow upon me," said Rudy. "An evening like this is worth a whole life. Often have I realized my good fortune, but never more than in this moment. I feel that if my existence were to end now, I should still have lived a happy life. What a glorious world this is! One day ends, and another begins even more beautiful than the last. How infinitely good God is, Babette! I have such complete happiness in my heart, said she. Earth has no more to bestow, answered Rudy. And then came the sound of the evening bells, borne upon the breeze over the mountains of Switzerland and Savoy, while still, in the golden splendour of the west, stood the dark blue mountains of Jura. God grant you all that is brightest and best, exclaimed Babette. He will, said Rudy. He will, tomorrow. Tomorrow you will be wholly mine, my own sweet wife. The boat, cried Babette suddenly. The boat in which they were to return had broken loose, and was floating away from the island. I will fetch it back, said Rudy. Throwing off his coat and boots, he sprang into the lake and swam with strong efforts towards it. The dark blue water from the glaciers of the mountains was icy cold and very deep. Rudy gave but one glance into the water beneath, but in that one glance he saw a gold ring rolling, glittering, and sparkling before him. His engaged ring came into his mind, but this was larger, and spread into a glittering circle in which appeared a clear glacier. Deep chasms yawned around it, the water drops glittered as if lighted with blue flame, and tinkled like the chiming of church bells. In one moment he saw what would require many words to describe. Young hunters and young maidens, men and women who had sunk in the deep chasms of the glaciers, stood before him here in lifelike forms, with eyes open and smiles on their lips, and far beneath them could be heard the chiming of the church bells of buried villages, where the villagers knelt beneath the vaulted arches of churches in which ice blocks formed the organ pipes and the mountain stream, the music. On the clear, transparent ground sat the ice maiden. She raised herself towards Rudy and kissed his feet, and instantly a cold, deathly chill, like an electric shock, passed through his limbs. Ice or fire? It was impossible to tell. The shock was so instantaneous. Mine, mine, sounded around him and within him. I kissed thee when thou wert a little child. I once kissed thee on the mouth, and now I have kissed thee from heel to toe. Thou art wholly mine. And then he disappeared in the clear blue water. All was still. The church bells were silent. The last tone floated away with the last red glimmer on the evening clouds. Thou art mine, sounded from the depths below, but from the heights above, from the eternal world, also sounded the words, Thou art mine. Happy was he thus to pass from life to life, from earth to heaven. A cord was loosened, and tones of sorrow burst forth. The icy kiss of death had overcome the perishable body. It was but the prelude before life's real drama could begin, the discord which was quickly lost in harmony. Do you think this a sad story? Poor Babette! For her it was unspeakable anguish. The boat drifted farther and farther away. No one on the opposite shore knew that the betrothed pair had gone over to the little island. The clouds sunk as the evening drew on, and it became dark. Alone, in despair, she waited and trembled. The weather became fearful. Flash after flash lighted up the mountains of Jura, Savoy, and Switzerland, while peals of thunder that lasted for many minutes rolled over her head. The lightning was so vivid that every single vine stem could be seen for a moment as distinctly as in the sunlight at noonday. And then all was veiled in darkness. It flashed across the lake in winding, zigzag lines, lighting it up on all sides, while the echoes of the thunder grew louder and stronger. On land, the boats were all carefully drawn up on the beach. Every living thing sought shelter, and at length the rain poured down in torrents. "Where can Rudy and Babette be in this awful weather?" said the miller. Poor Babette sat with her hands clasped and her head bowed down, dumb with grief. She had ceased to weep and cry for help. "In the deep water," she said to herself. "Far down he lies, as if beneath a glacier." Deep in her heart rested the memory of what Rudy had told her of the death of his mother, and of his own recovery, even after he had been taken up as dead from the cleft in the glacier. "Ah," she thought, "the Ice Maiden has him at last." Suddenly there came a flash of lightning, as dazzling as the rays of the sun on the white snow. The lake rose for a moment like a shining glacier, and before Babette stood the pallid, glittering, majestic form of the Ice Maiden. And at her feet lay Rudy's corpse. "Mine!" she cried, and again all was darkness around the heaving water. "How cruel," murmured Babette. "Why should he die just as the day of happiness drew near? Merciful God, enlighten my understanding, shed light upon my heart, for I cannot comprehend the arrangements of thy providence, even while I bow to the decree of thy almighty wisdom and power." And God did enlighten her heart. A sudden flash of thought, like a ray of mercy, recalled her dream of the preceding night. All was vividly represented before her. She remembered the words and wishes she had then expressed, that what was best for her and for Rudy she might piously submit to. "Woe is me," she said. "Was the germ of sin really in my heart? Was my dream a glimpse into the course of my future life, whose thread must be violently broken to rescue me from sin? Oh, miserable creature that I am!" Thus she sat, lamenting in the dark night, while through the deep stillness the last words of Rudy seemed to ring in her ears. "This earth has nothing more to bestow." Words, uttered in the fullness of joy, were again heard amid the depths of sorrow. Years have passed since this sad event happened. The shores of the peaceful lake still smile in beauty. The vines are full of luscious grapes. Steamboats with waving flags pass swiftly by. Pleasure boats with their swelling sails skim lightly over the watery mirror like white butterflies. The railway is opened beyond Chillon and goes far into the deep valley of the Rhone. At every station, strangers alight with red-bound guidebooks in their hands, in which they read of every place worth seeing. They visit Chillon and observe on the lake the little island with the 3 acacias, and then read in their guidebook the story of the bridal pair who, in the year 1856, rowed over to it. They read that the 2 were missing till the next morning, when some people on the shore heard the despairing cries of the bride and went to her assistance, and by her were told of the bridegroom's fate. But the guidebook does not speak of Babette's quiet life afterwards with her father, not at the mill strangers dwell there now, but in a pretty house in a row near the station. On many an evening she sits at her window and looks out over the chestnut trees to the snow-capped mountains on which Rudy once roamed. She looks at the alpine glow in the evening sky, which is caused by the children of the sun retiring to rest on the mountain tops. And again they breathe their song of the traveller whom the whirlwind could deprive of his cloak, but not of his life. There is a rosy tint on the mountain snow, and there are rosy gleams in each heart in which dwells the thought, God permits nothing to happen which is not the best for us. But this is not often revealed to all, as it was revealed to Babette in her wonderful dream.